Hey guys, tonight we begin with the life of a student under Copernicus. Cold ink on your fingers, starlight filtered through frost, and parchment spread across a splintering desk. The universe as you know, it is upside down, and you're rewriting it by candlelight, one smudged calculation at a time. So, while you're getting comfortable, feel free to tap like and subscribe if this kind of calm, late-night history is your thing. And I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment with your city and what time it was when you pressed play. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The cold creeps in before the sun even thinks of rising. It drapes over your shoulders like a second, unwelcome robe, stinging your fingers as you fumble with a stiff quill. Your study, if one dares to call it that, is a narrow wooden room tucked beneath the eaves of an old university building. The walls leak wind. The ink in your pot has developed a crust you have to poke through each morning. You'd warm it by the brazier, if the brazier weren't currently occupied by a kettle of barley water you've been reheating since yesterday. Priorities. A few pale candles flicker around you, spitting wax onto your only set of astronomical tables. You keep moving your elbow just in time to avoid burning the one page you copied correctly. Most mornings begin like this, cold, quiet, and steeped in repetition. Your job at the moment is to recopy a table of lunar oppositions compiled by some long-dead astronomer whose handwriting seems deliberately unfriendly. You squint, trying to distinguish between a smudged 7 and a poorly drawn 9. The page crackles when you move it. It's been reused twice already, scraped thin by cautious hands and tighter budgets. Your fingers ache as you press the neeb into the paper again, trying not to blot the column. One slip, and the master will make you start the whole row over, if he's in a good mood. Every so often, the icy silence is broken by a wheeze from the floorboards above, where someone else is also awake too early, and probably too cold. Occasionally, a dull knock echoes through the wall from your neighbor's side, a sign that his ink froze solid again, and he's trying to crack it loose. You nod in sympathy, though he can't see you. Here in this tower of minds, camaraderie is mostly made of shared suffering, not conversation. Talking risks heat loss. Besides, no one wants to be heard speculating about the planets just now, not with priests roaming the halls more frequently than usual. Your shoulders stiffen as you shift your weight. The wooden bench beneath you is the same one you've sat on for months. It was already crooked when you arrived, and now one leg is shorter than the others, slowly eroded by your constant rocking. The cushion is a folded cloak. There's a new tier along the seam where you've tried to sit just right to avoid the worst of the splinters. You adjust yourself again, shake your hand to bring feeling back into your fingers, and stare down the line of numbers stretching ahead. Each one is a tiny war of ink and willpower. It's not even light outside yet. There's a particular smell in the room now. Old wax, oil smoke, mildew from the parchment, and the faint tang of ink. You've come to associate that scent with a sort of waking trance. Hours pass without moving more than your wrist. Every breath puffs a faint cloud in the cold air. When you finally blink hard enough to refocus, your candle has burned halfway down, and your right knee is completely numb. You lean back slightly to stretch, hearing the small, sharp crack of your spine realigning. A dangerous luxury, that moment of pause. Any longer, and the drowsiness might win. You glance at the small shelf beside you. There's a flask of weak wine, wrapped in cloth to keep from freezing, and a loaf of yesterday's bread you plan to soften with steam later. But mostly your eyes drift toward the stack of books, ones you're not supposed to have. Old copies of Ptolemy and some suspiciously annotated commentaries from a friend in Krakow. You haven't dared open them lately. Not since the incident at Vespers, when a student was caught with a diagram of Earth, not sitting comfortably at the center of everything. The whispers say he was questioned for days. They also say he left for a quiet retreat in the countryside. No one expects him back. Still, you understand why he risked it. The numbers don't behave. They jump. They shift. They contradict themselves. Every time you finish a set of calculations based on the old geocentric models, the planets seem to mock you by drifting off course just a little more. You've learned to lie with your figures, ever so slightly. A nudge here, a rounding there. Nothing blasphemous. Nothing that would raise a brow. Just enough to make the math pretend to behave for one more day. The bells finally toll the hour, deep and low through the frozen stone. Morning prayers. You sigh, stretch your legs, and set down your pen. The page in front of you is half complete. Not good enough. You'll be back to it after the chapel. Maybe the sun will have melted the ice in the ink by then. You blow gently on the candle, and in the moment before darkness swallows the room, you glance once more at the numbers. They still don't make sense. And somehow, that makes you feel warmer than the fire ever could. Because even in your aching joints and bleary eyes, some small part of you suspects the truth is hiding behind those stubborn columns. The numbers don't fit, but what if they're not supposed to? What if the whole foundation needs rewriting? You don't dare say it aloud. Not yet. But the thought keeps flickering like your candle did, right before it went out. And with that thought quietly glowing inside you, you stand, brace against the cold, and prepare to face the next great challenge of the day, surviving another round of unkind math without a single useful tool. And it's there, hunched over your calculations, half frozen and entirely unsupervised, that the real labor begins, because the numbers are about to get worse, and the tools will not improve. You're heading straight into the next stretch of punishment, the math itself. By the time you return from chapel, the ink has thawed, but your optimism has not. The candles are shorter, the light is worse, and now your task is no longer copying, but calculating. And that's when the real despair begins. It's one thing to transcribe someone else's work, tedious as it may be. It's another entirely to sit alone with a blank sheet of parchment and a set of instructions that read. They were written by someone who resented you personally. Your master has assigned you a set of planetary conjunctions to work through. He doesn't expect you to find anything new. He's not that generous, but he wants to see if your numbers match Ptolemy's, which would be fine if Ptolemy weren't wrong so often. But he's still sacred, so it's your job to massage the errors until they look like truth. You sharpen your quill with a paring knife you probably weren't supposed to bring into the scriptorium. Mutter a small apology to whichever saint is assigned to mathematics, and begin. The numbers come slowly. Each step is its own kind of battle. First, you must identify the position of the sun for a specific date, then calculate where a planet should be in the sky relative to the deferents and epicycles layered over it like tangled string. Every movement has to be accounted for, circle within circle, sometimes even with eccentric orbits, which feel like heresy, even when they're official. There's no shorthand, no tables that make this easier. Everything is derived. Each new value is the result of 6 others that came before it. One mistake, and your whole chart veers off course, like a poorly balanced armillary sphere spinning itself into madness. There is, of course, no calculator, no logarithms, no decimals even. You work with Roman numerals when the manuscript demands it, and with base 60 sexagesimal notation when the old astronomers got too clever. You quickly learn that your best friend in this world is a small stack of pebbles you use like a personal abacus. You've grown surprisingly fond of them. They're smooth and warm from your hands, like tiny companions through suffering. One of them is slightly pink. You've named it Mars. The world outside your narrow window shifts slowly from gray to silver. You don't see the sun directly. It rises behind the cathedral, but the quality of the light changes. The frost on the glass begins to melt in streaks. You pause, stretch your back, and stare at the figures you've written. They look wrong. You check them again. Still wrong. The moon is too far west. You sigh, push aside the top parchment, and begin again, murmuring calculations under your breath like a monk reciting penance. You've lost count of how many pages you've torn through. You've started writing dates in the margins just to mark the passage of time, because no clock would dare tick this slowly. Occasionally, you scribble something irrelevant just to break the pattern. Need oil for the lamp. Left boot leaks again. Sun refuses to behave. You chuckle at that last one. The sun, in your models, is supposed to orbit the Earth with predictable devotion, but it keeps slipping out of alignment, nudging your epicycles off kilter. No matter how faithfully you follow the old rules, the numbers resist. It's almost spiteful. You begin to wonder if the problem isn't your math. Maybe it's the model. That dangerous thought flickers again. You've heard stories. Whispers about a man in Frauenburg who's dared to suggest the Earth might not be the center. You don't know his name, not officially. But you've seen students exchange papers in the stairwells, glanced at strange diagrams scratched onto the backs of sermon notes. You've even heard someone mutter the phrase heliocentric, like it was an obscenity. The idea pulls at you. It's absurd, of course. Impossible. Heretical. Tempting. Your master once warned you sternly that math is a tool of clarity, not of rebellion. You nodded then, but the phrase has always clung to you. Because what if the clarity leads to rebellion? What if the math, when pursued honestly, refuses to obey the script it's been given? You look down at your notes again. The moon is too far west. The sun's position is slightly off. The planet should be visible in the morning sky, but you saw it with your own eyes last night, glimmering just above the horizon. The numbers say one thing, your senses say another, and the model insists on staying still while the heavens move. You lean back and rub your eyes. Your vision swims. Black ink blurs into cream parchment. You exhale slowly and tap the edge of the table with your knuckles, setting a quiet rhythm. You wonder what it would be like to just start over. Not just the math, but the entire structure. Build a new model from scratch. One where the sun is at the center. One where the planets move in simpler paths. It's a fantasy, of course. You're not Copernicus. You're just a student with frozen fingers and no authority. But sometimes it's easier to believe in the impossible than to keep faking the improbable. Another error. You trace it back. A missed factor. 2 lines up. You erase, rewrite, and adjust your angle as the light shifts again. The sun must be higher now. You hear voices in the hallway. Students emerging for bread and broth. You'll join them soon, but not yet. You want to finish this set, even if it's wrong, even if it proves nothing. There's something satisfying about chasing truth through numbers, even when it hides behind bad models and worse handwriting. Your fingers cramp as you write the final value. The ink runs thin. You scrawl the last digit, draw a shaky box around it, and sit back. It's done. It's wrong, probably, but it's done. And as you shake the stiffness from your hand and cap the inkwell with a bit of cork, you glance toward the little stack of banned texts by your elbow. One of them holds a diagram you're not supposed to have seen, concentric circles, but with the sun in the middle. You haven't dared open it since last week. But the numbers today, they don't lie quietly anymore. You reach for the book. Just to look. Just to remind yourself what the dangerous idea actually looks like. You flip to the diagram and trace the orbit of Mars with your fingertip. There's a strange elegance to it. Simpler, cleaner, not easy, but possible. And that possibility is a kind of gravity all its own. You lean forward, elbows on the table, brow furrowed, curiosity blooming where frustration once sat. Because now you have to know where the manuscript came from, who drew the diagrams, and why it hasn't been destroyed. That path leads somewhere secret, somewhere forbidden, and it's calling you louder than the bells for midday meal. You don't remember when the first Forbiddens page came into your possession. It wasn't a dramatic handoff in a shadowy alley. or a parchment smuggled in a hollowed-out loaf of bread. It was quieter than that. A folded sheet slipped under your inkwell by someone who never admitted it. You unfolded it like one might open a letter from a ghost. No name, no introduction. Just a neat diagram. Earth pushed aside, sun at the center, planets spinning in calm circles. You stared at it for hours, tracing the lines with your finger again and again, as if the orbit might come alive. Ever since then, the manuscripts have begun to appear more often. A page tucked between prayer book leaves. A roll of notes handed to you as casually as a crust of bread. Most are copies of copies, handwritten by shaky hands in low light. The ink is inconsistent, the diagrams unfinished, but they all whisper the same rebellion. The heavens do not revolve around you, or anyone for that matter. The universe, it turns out, may not care who's watching. You've learned to keep them hidden with care. The shelf beside your desk contains a hollowed-out book on monastic chant, which now serves as a home for contraband. You've even affixed a false page over one of the diagrams with beeswax and prayer. Anyone flipping through would see nothing but Latin psalms, unless they looked very, very closely. There are stories of students caught with pages like these. Some were expelled. A few were quietly reassigned to distant monasteries. No one knows what happened to the man who brought the full manuscript from Frauenburg. Some say he returned to his estate. Others claim he was silenced in a chapel library, his books confiscated, his name struck from the register. Still, the manuscripts spread. Like pollen on the wind, they move from scholar to scholar, passing unnoticed through hands that know better than to leave fingerprints. Each one adds a fragment, a missing equation, a redrawn diagram, a footnote questioning the logic of epicycles. No single version contains everything, but you begin to sense a larger picture forming, one stitched together from countless stolen moments of curiosity. In the evenings, you gather with a small group of like-minded students. You never meet in the same room twice. Sometimes it's the upstairs storeroom, where broken globes are stored. Sometimes it's the west cloister after evening bell, where the wind hides your voices. You bring your fragments. Compare margins. Argue quietly. One of your friends insists that the moon cannot possibly orbit the Earth and stay in perfect rhythm with the sun's own motion. Another claims to have solved for retrograde motion without epicycles. You don't believe him, but you want to. The debates are spirited, whispered, and unfinished, always interrupted by the clanging of bells or the sound of a footstep in the corridor. One night, someone brings a diagram unlike anything you've seen. Not just heliocentric, but annotated in careful red ink. Each planet labeled with both its period and its distance from the sun. The proportions are astonishingly accurate. It's a reconstruction of the Copernican model in full. Not just a sketch, not just a rumor, but a working set of figures. You pass it around like a holy relic, each of you holding it like it might evaporate in the cold air. The author's name is missing. You suspect it was removed on purpose. Still, there's something oddly familiar in the hand. Neat, cautious. Like someone who wrote always half expecting to be interrupted. You return to your chamber that night with your heart racing. The page burns in your satchel like contraband gold. You read it again by candlelight, whispering the notes aloud to yourself, as if the syllables might seal them in memory. It's not perfect. The calculations are incomplete. There's a discrepancy in the orbit of Jupiter, but the shape is there. The idea is real. It exists in ink, not just theory, and someone risked everything to put it there. That's when the fear starts to creep in. If this page was found, if you were found, you could be ruined. Not just expelled, but marked, questioned, possibly worse. The Church's position is clear. Scripture places the Earth at the center. To suggest otherwise is to rewrite not only the heavens, but the very structure of divine order. And while many of your masters are tolerant of inquiry, none would defend outright defiance. You know the difference. Curiosity is allowed. Revolution is not. So you grow more careful. Your notes are written in code. You develop a shorthand using Greek letters and astronomical glyphs. Your diagrams are drawn in chalk, then erased immediately. You speak in riddles. Your group stops meeting as often. Some students fall silent. One disappears entirely. You hear he transferred to a monastery in the hills, but no one can confirm it. The others seem spooked. One burns his notes. Another returns to Ptolemy with sudden fervor, praising the elegance of epicycles a bit too loudly. But for you, the idea has already taken root. You can't unsee the model. You can't make the math behave in the old system. The epicycles feel clumsy now. The eccentric circles strain belief. And every time you look up at the sky, it's harder to pretend you don't see the planets moving differently than you were told they must. The stars no longer wheel around the Earth. Instead, it's you who feels like you're turning. One evening, just as you're about to douse your candle, there's a knock at your door. A single tap, then silence. You wait. Nothing. You open it cautiously, heart pounding, but the hallway is empty. On the floor is a folded parchment. No name, no seal, just a diagram. It's the same layout, the same structure, but with one crucial addition. A small symbol near the center. A sun surrounded by tiny orbits. And beneath it, a single word, revolutionibus. Your breath catches. You know that name. You've heard it spoken only once, in hushed tones, by a visiting scholar from Krakow, who seemed immediately regretful for saying it. It's not a theory anymore. It's a manuscript, a real one, circulating in pieces, scattered across rooms like yours. The thought thrills you and terrifies you. Because if the manuscript is moving underground, then someone must be keeping track of who touches it. You slide the parchment into your satchel, wrap it in linen, and stare into the dark for a long time before sleeping. The diagram hovers behind your eyes as you drift off. Not heretical, not dangerous. Just a new kind of map for an old kind of sky. And in the morning, as the frost reforms on your window pane and the ink stiffens in its jar once more, your task will change. You'll need to whisper a little more carefully, tread a little more lightly, and cover your diagrams more quickly, because soon, even quiet curiosity won't be enough to protect you from the consequences of thinking differently. The manuscript stays hidden beneath your cloak for days. You don't dare unfold it again in daylight. Instead, you wait until the chapel bells toll Compline and the cloisters fall into the hush of evening. That's when the conspiracy resumes, slow, quiet, and flickering in candlelight. Your group meets less often now, but more cautiously. You've moved to a disused records room in the east wing of the dormitory, where the ledgers of dead priests are left to gather mildew and mice. It smells like damp wool and ink rot, but the walls are thick, and the door has a satisfying creak that serves as its own warning system. There are only 4 of you now. Fewer voices, but more certainty. No one comes out of curiosity anymore, only commitment. Each member brings something different. A smuggled diagram, a page of formulas, a Latin translation scratched over a devotional hymn. You light only one candle between you, shielded by a clay pot with holes punched through the sides. It casts soft beams like stars onto the ceiling. Someone jokes that it's the only accurate constellation model you'll ever own. No one laughs loudly. Tonight, the discussion is tense. One of the others claims he's found a flaw in the new model, a wobble in the motion of Venus that throws off the entire pattern. You argue quietly, fingers tracing figures in the dust on the floor. Someone suggests adjusting the orbital period, but the math becomes Messier. You pull out a page from the manuscript that shows a hand-drawn ellipse, something dangerously close to what you'd later learn is Kepler's thinking. But for now, it feels like blasphemy squared. Circles are sacred. Ellipses are suspicious. Still, the data fits better. That makes it worse. The conversation drifts toward dangerous waters. What if these discrepancies are signs that even the new model isn't perfect? What if it's just another halfway step, like Ptolemy was before it? You all fall quiet for a moment. The candle sputters, reminding you how thin the margin is between light and smoke. Then someone clears his throat and asks a question that changes everything. Do you think Copernicus knows we're reading it? It's meant as a joke, but it lands like a warning. You don't answer. Instead, you look around at the scattered pages between you. None of this was meant for students like you. If the author wanted wide approval, he would have published it openly, not let it circulate in whispers. Maybe you're not readers, you're trespassers. That thought lingers longer than you'd like. Still, the work continues. The truth doesn't ask for permission. You copy a diagram onto the inside of your robe's hem. A private reference hidden in folds of wool. Someone else pins a celestial chart behind a framed icon in their chamber. There's a strange intimacy in it, these quiet acts of disobedience that feel less like rebellion and more like devotion to something older than dogma. Some nights, you work alone. You light a candle, lean low over your desk, and sketch new planetary paths in the margins of your course notes. The flame dances in the ink bottle's reflection, and for a moment, it looks like the sun, surrounded by trembling rings of light. You've begun to dream of orbits. You wake with calculations half-formed in your head. At meals, you catch yourself murmuring numbers under your breath. Once, a senior student asks if you're composing a hymn. You nod and smile. He doesn't press. Every precaution becomes a ritual. You test the ink on scraps before committing it to parchment. You write on reused pages, so no one thinks your diagrams are anything but mistakes. You rotate your texts weekly between hiding spots, inside a hollow footstool, behind a loose tile near the choir stalls, even tucked into the lining of your cloak's hood. It's not paranoia. It's protocol. You've heard rumors of a novice in Vienna, questioned for simply owning a copy of the Sphere. It didn't matter that the book was technically approved. It was the margin notes they didn't like. Still, for all the care and secrecy, there's a strange warmth to these nights. You feel connected to something vast and unfinished. You think of the people who must be doing the same in other cities. Krakow, Bologna, Padua, hunched over dim lights, thinking forbidden thoughts, reshaping the sky without permission. You wonder if they also feel both terrified and exhilarated at once. Like you're standing on the edge of a map that was never meant to be redrawn. Sometimes, when the moon is full and the clouds are merciful, you slip outside. You climb the narrow tower stairs and push open the creaking hatch that leads to the roof. From there, the sky unfolds above you, so wide and quiet, it feels like the ceiling of a cathedral. You bring your parchment and hold it up, matching lines to stars. You don't know if your models are correct, but the planets don't care what the old books say. They move as they always have, calm, steady, unbothered by doctrine. You sit there, half frozen, chart in one hand and candle guttering beside you, and you begin to trace an orbit with your fingertip across the sky itself. That's when it hits you, the thrill of alignment. Not just with the stars, but with something deeper. The feeling that the truth is just barely out of reach, not in the heavens, but in your own persistence. All the secrecy, all the copying, all the bending over parchment in aching silence is not just resistance. It's belief, in reason, in the quiet pursuit of answers, in the idea that understanding is worth the risk. And yet, belief alone is fragile, because tomorrow, a sermon might be given that names your curiosity as pride. A bishop might arrive unannounced to examine the students' chambers. A peer might speak too freely at supper. The network is delicate, and the circle is small. You cannot afford to trust widely. Only the stars are reliable. Still, you'll keep showing up. You'll keep whispering over candlelight, tracing dangerous orbits in chalk, watching your breath swirl in cold air, as if the universe is slowly exhaling back. And the deeper you go, The more it becomes clear, your quiet questioning is no longer just a habit. It's a way of life. Which is why, when a new priest arrives to deliver a series of lectures about the divine geometry of the geocentric universe, you straighten your back, fold your notes tighter, and pay attention, for once not to learn, but to see how carefully one must now tread between the church and the cosmos. The priest arrives draped in velvet, with the quiet gravity of someone who expects every word he speaks to be copied. He is not old, exactly, but he carries himself as though he's already been quoted for centuries. His lectures are to be held each morning for a week, and attendance is mandatory. You file in with the others, robes stiff with frost, notes concealed somewhere in your layers of wool and resolve. The hall is warmer than usual. The brazier crackles. That should be comforting. It isn't. His topic is the mathematical harmonies of the divine cosmos, and within minutes it's clear he isn't just teaching astronomy. He's reaffirming a worldview. Earth at the center, Sun as its loyal servant, spheres nested like a heavenly onion, each turning in perfect obedience to its place in the grand design. The music of the spheres, he calls it, with the cadence of someone who believes the stars hum Gregorian chant. You take notes, carefully and visibly. He watches your quill more than your face. His diagrams are crisp. His chalk makes confident arcs on the board. Great circles of fire, each labeled with its angelic mover. You almost admire his certainty. There is no math here, not really. Just geometry framed as theology. He cites Aristotle as easily as he does Augustine. When he reaches the topic of epicycles, he slows down and looks at the room as if daring anyone to smirk. No one does. You wonder how many others in the hall are hiding questions beneath their sleeves. Probably fewer than you'd hope. That night, your study group debates the lecture in frustrated whispers. One of you tries to recreate the priest's diagram, only to burst out laughing at the absurdity of 20 concentric circles, all spinning together in harmony. Someone else hushes him immediately. Laughter carries even through stone. The conversation pivots to more serious tones. What happens, you ask, if this priest suspects someone is thinking too freely? Who would he tell? What would he do? You don't get an answer. Instead, you all fall silent again, the way people do when they suddenly remember they're not invisible. You share a single look, a brief flicker of understanding. The truth you're chasing isn't just difficult. It's dangerous. Not because it's wrong, but because it isn't allowed. Later that week, the priest speaks on celestial obedience. He draws a comparison between the motion of the stars and the structure of society. Just as the heavens revolve around Earth, he says, so too must man revolve around the will of the divine. The stars obey, so must you. You feel the chill of implication. Your hand pauses above your parchment. It's not a warning, not exactly, but it's close enough to make your ribs tighten. After the lecture, he stops to speak with students. He smiles often, but his questions are sharp. He asks one about the lunar calendar, another about retrograde motion. Then he turns to you. And you, he says lightly, are you finding comfort in the old models or confusion in the new ones? The question hangs too long in the air. You answer that the old models are elegant, but sometimes difficult to reconcile with observation. He studies you a second longer than necessary, then nods and moves on. You exhale only once he's out of sight. You spend the next few nights going back over your work, not to improve the models, but to erase the footprints. You scrape diagrams from pages, burn sheets with notes in unsteady hands, and replace your hidden texts with decoys, harmless treatises on weather and geometry. You're not giving up, but you're learning caution faster than astronomy. Still, questions keep bubbling up. Why does the moon's apparent size vary if it moves in a perfect circle? Why do eclipses follow a pattern that the old models fumble to explain? Why do the planets occasionally move backward in the sky, unless perhaps it's not the planets that are doing the turning? In the refectory, you hear others echo the priest's ideas. The earth must be still, one student declares confidently, because it feels still. Another points out that scripture makes no mention of a spinning globe. You stir your broth in silence, wondering what it would take for someone to trade certainty for truth. Apparently, more than a misbehaving epicycle. But something else is shifting now, not in the sky, but in you. The lectures don't fill you with doubt about the heliocentric model. Instead, they make you realize how tightly some minds are bound to the comfort of authority. The priest's arguments are beautiful, but brittle. They require silence, compliance. You've seen too many numbers that won't sit still to believe in stillness anymore. You begin writing in a new code, simpler, cleaner. Fewer notes on paper, more in your mind. You test diagrams with sand on the floor and erase them with your boot. You calculate by candlelight, glancing at the door every few minutes. The work feels heavier now, not because it's harder, but because you understand what's at stake. The church guards more than doctrine. It guards a vision of the universe. It keeps everything, every soul, every motion, every question in its ordained place. And you're beginning to slip outside that orbit, which is why, when word spreads that a certain canon in Frauenburg has finally agreed to publish his strange, sun-centered theories, you feel something between panic and awe. The whispers say the book will be printed soon. They say he waited until he was nearly dead to send it. They say the pages are full of quiet heresies written in the calmest Latin. You don't know if any of that is true. But you do know one thing. You need to see that book. The first rumors of the book arrive like ash on the wind, hazy, slow, and strangely quiet. No one announces it. There is no fanfare. Only a whispered name. De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium. You're not even sure how to pronounce it properly at first. The phrase appears scribbled in the margin of a commentary one morning, then muttered by a senior scholar in passing. Soon it becomes the thing you all tiptoe around, as if saying it aloud might summon attention you aren't ready to handle. You hear that the author, a canon in a distant cathedral town, had been working on the manuscript for decades. You hear that he delayed publishing it for years, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of perfectionism. Some say he wrote the entire thing in secret and only released it when death seemed close enough to shield him from the backlash. Others claim he had no choice, that pressure from younger scholars finally forced the words from his ink-stained hands. No one can confirm the truth, but you begin to imagine him often, bent over parchment in a quiet tower, not unlike your own, squinting at the stars and whispering math into the silence. The idea that such a man exists, someone who dared to reshape the sky not with a sword or a sermon, but with ratios and diagrams, plants something stubborn in your chest. A new kind of courage. You begin to work more confidently, even if still in secret. You redraw your tables with the sun in the center. You stop pretending that the old models might still be right. You don't say this out loud, of course, but the shift is real, even if only on parchment. The stars haven't changed, but how you see them has. The retrograde motion that once required awkward circles now traces itself neatly in your figures. The strange delays and accelerations make sense. For the first time, the sky feels less like a riddle and more like a pattern you might actually understand, if only you had time to trace every arc, every loop, every pause. It's no longer about disproving the old system. It's about building something better. Still, there is no triumph, no grand revelation, just long nights, aching fingers, and an ever-growing awareness that knowledge, once glimpsed, refuses to be unlearned. Even the doubts feel different now. Not the kind that make you question the model, but the kind that whisper, if this is true, what else might be? What else have we mistaken for certainty? You begin to wonder how many others are out there, working alone, hunched over tables, hoping their calculations don't betray them in public. You imagine a quiet network of astronomers and students, each one a candle in the dark, charting new courses across forbidden thought. You wish you could speak with them. You wish there was a way to share without fear. But for now, the best you can do is add your pages to the growing quiet revolution. One evening, while reorganizing your notes beneath the floorboards, you come across the earliest diagrams you copied by hand. Perfect concentric circles, labeled Earth at the center, Sun obediently circling outside. You hold the page for a moment. Then, with a soft breath, you fold it and slide it into the back of your satchel, not to destroy, but to keep. Not as truth, but as proof of how far you've come. And as you sit back down at your desk, lighting your lamp and opening a clean sheet of parchment, you wonder what kind of man would risk everything to put these thoughts into print. Who would publish such a thing? How would he live with that knowledge pressing against his quiet life? To understand that, you'll need to follow the path back to its source, to Frauenberg, to the cautious canon who dared to rearrange the heavens, and who may never have wanted the world to know he'd done it at all. You arrive in Frauenberg expecting something grander. After all, this is where the man lives, the one whose ideas now rattle around in your head each night, rearranging the cosmos while you struggle to sleep. But the town is small, almost modest. Perched on the edge of the Vistula lagoon, it smells of fish, wood smoke, and damp stone. The wind off the water carries the scent of salt and rotting nets. Seagulls shriek overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls with a cracked, uncertain tone. This is no Athens, no Alexandria. It feels like a place built to be ignored. The cathedral complex looms above the town on a low hill, flanked by a cluster of brick buildings with red roofs and thin chimneys. It's here that Nicolaus Copernicus lives, not in a scholarly fortress, but as a canon of the church. His life, at least on paper, is filled with ordinary responsibilities. He manages estates, collects rents, and keeps watch over the cathedral's schedule. You picture him in robes, walking the narrow hallways with a bundle of keys and a stack of administrative complaints tucked under one arm. It is not the image of a revolutionary. You learn that his calendar is one of the most accurate in the region, not because of divine inspiration, but because he obsesses over it. While others glance at the sky and guess the dates of solstices and holy days, Copernicus checks the stars nightly, making adjustments with quiet precision. He uses a crude quadrant mounted in the cathedral's tower. Nothing elaborate, just a long staff and a careful eye. His tools are humble. His results are not. The locals trust his predictions more than they trust the priests who preach beside him. By day, he is unremarkable. He attends services, manages correspondence, and walks the damp courtyards without ceremony. But there is a quietness to him that makes you pause. He listens more than he speaks. When he does speak, his words are slow, careful, chosen like tools from a drawer he keeps locked most of the time. He answers questions with questions. Even in casual conversation, he gives the sense of someone always recalculating, always weighing the angle of every orbit, even social ones. You are granted a few moments with him, under the pretext of discussing calendar corrections. You sit in a study that smells of ink and sea air, surrounded by volumes stacked like firewood. He asks you to read a passage from a treatise on eclipses, and silently gestures for your thoughts. You offer something modest about the accuracy of lunar predictions. He nods once, slowly, and says, "We measure what we think we see, but often we are only confirming what we expect." The sentence lands like a stone dropped into a deep well. You nod politely, but your mind races. That is the sort of phrase a man writes in the margins of dangerous books. That is not the language of a church bureaucrat. That is the voice of someone who knows what it means to doubt the foundations and live quietly with the consequences. He doesn't mention his manuscript. He doesn't have to. It's never far from either of your minds. You imagine the stack of pages tucked somewhere in this very room, sheets worn smooth at the edges, equations scratched out and redrawn. diagrams annotated in the same careful ink he now uses to mark rent payments. The revolution is here, sleeping beneath ledgers and receipts. And it is a revolution, even if no one marshes, even if no trumpets sound, one that changes how the stars are drawn, how the heavens are mapped, how the divine order is understood. Yet the man responsible for it still signs weather reports and politely refuses dinner invitations from bishops. You learn later that he's already shared parts of his theory with close friends, mathematicians, scholars, a few carefully chosen clerics. One of them had begged him to publish. Another copied portions and began distributing them in academic circles. But Copernicus, you're told, has always hesitated. Not from fear of the church, at least not overtly, but from a deep unease with disruption. He is not a man who wants to shake the pillars. He wants to place the sun gently at the center of the universe and have no one notice until it's already been there for years. And yet, he must know. He must understand what his ideas mean. Perhaps that's why he hides them behind careful silence in a reputation for clerical diligence. No one suspects a man with a perfect calendar of being the one who dismantled the cosmos. His power lies in his slowness, in his refusal to rush a thought that could ruin the tidy order of everything else. Still, you begin to sense the weight he carries. The long pause before he answers. The way he fingers the corner of a page as if it might turn on its own. The way he glances at the window when someone walks past outside. These are not the habits of a man at peace. They are the habits of someone who has mapped a new world, but cannot yet bear to live in it. As you leave the study, the wind picks up, and the papers on his desk flutter slightly. He places a steady hand over them, not with panic, but with practiced calm. You realize then, he's spent his life keeping two worlds from colliding, the orderly world of duties and doctrine, and the other one, the one that waits just beneath the surface, where the sun stands still and everything else moves in quiet defiance. And as night settles in over Frauenburg, you find yourself drawn to the tower where he is said to watch the stars. You climb the narrow staircase, one slow step at a time, wondering what it feels like to measure the sky with your own eyes and see it refuse to obey the old design. The stairs to the tower aren't built for comfort. Each step is a different height than the last, as if the masons who laid them long ago had grown bored with symmetry halfway through construction. You climb carefully, one hand on the damp, cold wall to steady yourself. It smells of old limestone and the faintest trace of candle soot, remnants of the many who've come before you, carrying torches up these same winding stairs to reach the rooftop and look up. And now, here you are, a student still sore from days of squinting at figures, chasing the very stars that make those numbers misbehave. At the top, the trapdoor sticks for a moment, and you have to lean your weight against it to push it open. It gives with a tired groan, and suddenly the wind greets you like a long-missed friend. You step out into the night, onto a wooden platform that creaks beneath your boots. There's no handrail, only a low stone wall dusted with moss and bird droppings. One strong gust and a careless moment could send your notes flying straight into the dark. Or you, for that matter. But up here, the view erases the climb. The sky over Frauenburg is vast and deep, a wash of velvet black, stitched with countless trembling lights. The stars seem closer here, brighter, clearer, more insistent. They don't twinkle so much as pulse, steady and calm, like ancient beacons that have seen more questions than you could ever ask. The Vistula lagoon glows faintly below, reflecting pinpricks of starlight, while the rooftops of the cathedral complex huddle beneath you, quiet and watchful, as if they too are listening for something. And there he is, Copernicus. You find him already seated near the quadrant, one elbow resting on a small ledger, his face turned upward. The moonlight softens his features, aging him in profile, and then making him young again, depending on the angle. He doesn't speak. doesn't acknowledge your approach with more than a gentle nod. He's not being cold. He's simply elsewhere, in that quiet zone between thought and observation, where the rest of the world fades into the shape of the heavens. You sit beside him, folding your cloak tighter around your shoulders. It's colder than you expected, and the wind whistles between the slats of the wooden floor. A candle burns in a small lantern on the ground beside him, its flame steady despite the breeze. The light casts strange shadows across the pages of the notebook he occasionally consults. You catch a glimpse of tidy rows of numbers, brief Latin notations, and a few faint sketches, circles, arcs, the sweep of time across the night. He murmurs something under his breath. You don't quite catch it at first, but then he says it again, clearer. Venus is behind. You follow his gaze toward the eastern sky and locate the familiar shimmer just above the horizon. It should have risen earlier, according to the old models. But here it is, fashionably late, as if in polite protest of the Earth-centered view. I used to blame my eyesight, he says quietly. Then I blamed the air, then the instruments. It took me too long to realize I was asking the wrong question. You turn to look at him, but he doesn't meet your eye. His attention remains fixed upward. What question was that? You ask. He smiles faintly. What do I need to change to make the stars obey? It's a small sentence, soft, almost playful, but it lands with a weight you can feel in your ribs. That's the question, isn't it? The one hidden under all the copying, the calculating, the sleepless nights hunched over parchment. The question that unravels everything once you dare to ask it out loud. You sit there together for what feels like hours, not speaking, not even moving much, except to adjust the quadrant or glance at a distant point of light. You begin to understand why he does this. There's something deeply human about watching the sky this way, unfiltered, unhurried. It's not just science. It's a kind of prayer, a ritual of patience. The stars don't explain themselves. They just shine, and it's your job to follow. Copernicus eventually stands, stretching with a quiet groan, and you notice the slight stiffness in his knees. He's not old, not yet, but the years of crouching over pages and pacing damp stone halls have clearly left their mark. He gestures toward the quadrant and asks you to record a measurement. You take his place beside the instrument and do as he asks. Your fingers are slow from the cold, but your notes are steady. When you look up again, he's watching, not to supervise, but simply to see if you see what he sees. Back inside, he offers you a mug of warm wine, mulled with something earthy and sharp. The fire in the hearth is small, but determined, and you both warm your hands without speaking. You look around the room again. It's filled with books, yes, but also with maps, ledgers, astronomical tables, and shelves filled with meticulously labeled volumes of rent records and weather logs. It strikes you how much of his life is spent in maintenance, of property, of order, of appearances. And yet, somewhere among all this domestic ecclesiastical normalcy, he is redrawing the universe. Does it ever frighten you? You ask, your voice softer than you intend. He glances toward the window, where the reflection of the moon is caught in the glass. Sometimes, he says, but less than it used to. The heavens are still there, no matter where we place the center. He doesn't say it with arrogance. There's no pride in his tone, just resignation, perhaps even peace. He knows what he's done. He also knows what it might cost. And yet, he keeps going night after night, one quiet observation at a time. Back in your own quarters, you lay out your notes with new purpose. You draw cleaner circles, allow for longer calculations, and begin rethinking how you record distance and speed. You write with less fear now. You still hide the pages, yes, but not from shame, only from interruption. Because you know, in some far-off city, others are beginning to see it too. But as you prepare to rest, your mind drifts to one persistent question. How much of his manuscript is finished? How much is still trapped in loose pages, scribbled calculations, and cautious diagrams that never leave the tower. It's time to find out. Time to uncover how this man, this soft-spoken canon with careful hands and colder nights, has chosen to commit his ideas to paper. Or if, perhaps, someone else is already helping him put those dangerous thoughts into a form the world can read. You first catch sight of the manuscript by accident. It isn't presented with ceremony. No reverent unveiling. No flickering torchlight or hushed explanations. It's just there one afternoon, sitting under a pile of invoices on a side table near Copernicus's desk, partly obscured by a rolled map of cathedral landholdings and a blotter weighted with a spoon. You recognize the handwriting before anything else, tight, slanted, conservative strokes with only the faintest flare, where the tail of a letter dares to loop too wide. The paper is worn smooth at the edges. You see figures, tables, and on one visible page, a small sun drawn not at the edge of things, but directly at the center. You don't mention it. Neither does he. For the rest of the day, you help him catalog rent ledgers, draft a letter to a neighboring canon about a boundary dispute, and review a report on a failing vineyard. But every so often, your eyes drift back to the manuscript. He notices, of course. He always notices, but he never comments. Only when you're leaving does he say quietly, "You may look at it tomorrow, if you'd like. I will be in the sacristy until vespers." The next day, you arrive earlier than usual, find the room empty, and there it is, waiting. No locks, no seals. Just pages stacked and weighted, ink fading here and there, with smudges where he's rested his wrist while writing. You sit slowly, as if noise might somehow damage the paper. You lift the first sheet and begin to read. It's not a manifesto. There are no bold declarations or philosophical flourishes. The tone is cautious, scholarly, and meticulous. He opens with a mathematical preface, explaining not what he believes, but how the current models fail to reconcile observation with prediction. He doesn't accuse. He doesn't argue. He just adds numbers, builds circles, subtracts orbits. His revolution is made of margins. The sun appears on page 4, not dramatically, not even prominently. Just a small correction, nestled within an otherwise dull paragraph. But everything changes there. From that point forward, the universe bends. All the calculations shift. The circles get wider, the models simpler, the errors fewer. He never says, "I am right." He simply lets the results speak. And they do, quietly, but with startling clarity. You begin to understand why he hesitated to publish. This isn't a theory built to provoke. It's a structure meant to endure. It doesn't attack geocentrism. It steps around it, like someone avoiding a sleeping dog in a narrow alley. The tone is almost apologetic, as though he's more worried about upsetting the elegance of tradition than the wrath of the church. Yet every line gently unravels the assumptions of both. By the time you finish the first dozen pages, your hand aches from copying notes. You don't dare remove the manuscript from the room, so you write as fast as you can, stopping only when the light begins to fade. The sun is low over the lagoon when you finally push your stool back and exhale. You haven't even scratched the surface. Later, you find out that this is not the only copy. He sent pieces of it to trusted colleagues, mathematicians, some of whom are also clergy, some not. There are drafts circulating, being critiqued, quietly rewritten, but always in fragments, never in whole. He's cautious. He doesn't want it taken from him, altered without his consent. He has reason to be wary. You also learn that he has no plans to publish soon. Not unless someone forces his hand. For now, he keeps writing one afternoon at a time between estate duties and church meetings. The manuscript lives in a room shared with ledgers and weather reports. It isn't being hidden. Exactly. It just isn't being invited into the world. You begin to help him, discreetly. He never asks. But one day, He leaves a stack of unnumbered pages and a quill near your seat. And when you glance at him, he simply says, "Check the planetary distances again, will you? I think I made a misstep with Mars." So you do. And then another page. Then another. Soon, you're spending entire evenings copying tables, plotting circular paths, recalculating ratios. You aren't correcting his work, merely verifying it, but the intimacy of the task feels like stepping into someone else's mind. You begin to recognize his patterns, where he slows down, where he hesitates, where the ink trails off mid-sentence as though even he isn't yet sure how to finish. One night, as you're revising a chart for Saturn, you notice a small note scribbled in the margin beside it. Just a single word: dubium. Doubt. You run your finger over the ink. The mark is faint. You wonder how long it took him to write it. You wonder how many more such doubts are buried in the manuscript. Quiet acknowledgments that even in this bold new system, not every question has an answer. And that, somehow, makes it more real. More human. He's not building a perfect cosmos. He's sketching a better approximation, one that dares to be unfinished. But the longer you work on it, the more you feel the pressure building, like thunder rolling in from across the water. You start to realize that a manuscript like this can't stay secret forever. Eventually, someone will force it into the light. The church won't ignore it. Neither will the scholars it contradicts. It will be questioned, dissected, resisted. And when it is, it won't just be the author they come for. It may be everyone who touched it. You glance at the stack beside you. The diagrams, the annotations, the subtle, almost shy rearrangement of the heavens. It's beautiful, precise, radical, and utterly at odds with everything the world insists must be true. The candle beside you sputters, its flame bending as if trying to escape. You cup it with your hand, shielding it from the draft. The pages in front of you flutter slightly. You press your palm down to still them. You feel their weight, thin paper, heavy with implication. And as you exhale, you begin to wonder, will he ever publish it? Will he find the courage, or the excuse, to stop revising and let it go? Or will the pages grow old in this quiet room, known only to a few trusted hands, until the ink fades and the stars forget? If you want answers to that, you'll have to keep watching him, not just at his desk, but in the way he speaks, the choices he delays, the friends he trusts, and the silences that grow longer each time someone brings up the future. There's a strange rhythm to life in Frauenburg, part pastoral, part astronomical, and all of it threaded through with a kind of deliberate restraint. Days begin with the tolling of the bells, signaling morning prayers. Afterward, there are meetings with local tenants about broken fences or barley yields, letters to answer from nearby clergy, and the endless management of estates that never seem to fix themselves. Amid all of it, Copernicus remains calm, composed, and maddeningly consistent. You begin to notice how carefully he moves through each task, as if rehearsing the motions of someone who doesn't wish to be noticed. The revolution in his study is never visible on his face. You once asked him gently why he hadn't published his book. He looked at you for a long time before answering, not irritated, but cautious, like someone who'd been asked whether or not he believed in ghosts. "Because it isn't ready," he said, "and neither is the world." Then he returned to folding a letter addressed to a bishop in Gask, sealing it with wax like the conversation had never happened. The truth is, Copernicus is not afraid in the way people expect. He does not pace the halls at night or flinch at every knock on the door. His hesitation is quieter than fear. It's closer to responsibility. He knows what his model does. He's followed the logic to its end. The Earth moves. The sun stands still. The planets spiral outward, not inward, and the stars are suddenly farther away than anyone dared imagine. He didn't set out to be a heretic. He simply wanted the numbers to behave. And they did, once he placed the sun at the center. But that placement doesn't just tidy the math. It dismantles a worldview. For over 1,000 years, the Earth has been the cosmic anchor, the unmoving platform for human history. Heaven above, hell below, and mankind poised at the crossroads. Copernicus has knocked that structure loose, not with protest, but with parchment and ink. It's no wonder he hesitates. Privately, you've begun to think of him not as a rebel, but as a gardener. He tends his model like a delicate vine, pruning equations, correcting ratios, adjusting diagrams not for drama, but for truth. There's nothing theatrical about him, no hunger for fame. If anything, he recoils from it. And yet, piece by piece, the pages stack higher. The book is becoming something complete, whether he wants it to or not. It's not that no one knows. Word has spread, quietly but steadily. You hear that certain scholars in Wittenberg have already begun to circulate summaries of the model. A few theologians have requested commentaries under false names. One visiting professor from Leipzig claimed to have seen a diagram identical to Copernicus's in a private library in Venice. And still, Copernicus remains silent. He listens, nods, and then changes the subject. Once, while walking along the shore near the lagoon, you pressed him gently about the delay. He stopped and looked out across the water for a long while, watching a ship vanish toward the horizon. "If I publish," he said, "people will say I've mocked the scriptures. If I wait, they'll say I was afraid. There's no time when it will not cause trouble." Then he turned and continued walking, and you followed, boots crunching softly on wet pebbles. The hesitation becomes heavier with each passing season. The manuscript is nearly finished. The calculations are checked, the diagrams refined, the footnotes reconciled. All that remains is permission, or perhaps permission to stop waiting. Yet he lingers, like a man with his hand on the door, unwilling to open it, not because he fears what's outside, but because he knows it will never close again. You watch him age into his revolution. His hair grays, his hands tremble slightly when holding the quadrant, and he spends more time seated in the cathedral courtyard than climbing to the tower. But the book still grows. You help him organize pages, file diagrams, rewrite tables. He still refuses to send it to a printer. You begin to wonder if he ever will. Then one winter evening, as snow collects in crooked little heaps on the windowsill, a letter arrives. It's from Georg Joachim Rheticus, a young mathematician and astronomer who has studied under Lutheran reformers in Wittenberg. The letter is respectful, effusive, and filled with cautious admiration. Rheticus claims to have read summaries of the heliocentric model and begs really, for permission to study directly under Copernicus. You expect him to ignore it. Instead, he reads the letter twice, folds it carefully, and sets it beside the manuscript without a word. Weeks later, Rheticus arrives. He is younger than you expected, restless, eager, and full of questions he's only barely learned to keep polite. Copernicus receives him warmly, if somewhat amused. And to your surprise, he agrees to let the young scholar stay and study. Within days, Rheticus is knee-deep in the manuscript, copying charts, asking impertinent questions, and brimming with energy. He speaks of publication as if it's inevitable, which makes Copernicus furrow his brow, but never quite rebuke him. The presence of another scholar shifts the mood. There's a sense now that something is happening, something beyond the careful pace of your previous work. Rheticus is persuasive. He argues that the book must be printed soon, before the model is misrepresented by others, before someone else takes the credit, or worse, mangles the details. You agree with him, quietly. But Copernicus remains cautious. He allows discussion, even planning, but he gives no final word. Then Rheticus takes a bolder step. Without your knowledge, and perhaps without full permission, he publishes a small treatise, a kind of preview of the heliocentric theory, written in his own words. It's not the full revolution, but it is close. The narratio prima spreads quickly, especially among scholars already questioning the old system. Copernicus says little when he reads it, just a small frown and a sigh that sounds equal parts regret and inevitability. You realize then that the door has already opened. The theory is no longer his secret. The moment is approaching. And for all his reluctance, for all his hope that maybe he could slip this idea into the world without noise, the universe does not work that way. The question now is not whether he will publish, but who will help him do it without the message being twisted or silenced. That decision will soon fall not just to him, but to those closest to the work, you included. Spring does not arrive in Frauenburg with trumpets or thawing joy. It arrives slowly, like a hesitant messenger unsure whether it's welcome. The snow doesn't melt so much as slink away, retreating into the shadows of stone buildings and sagging roof tiles. The Vistula lagoon begins to shift from ice to brine, gray and sluggish, like something waking from an old, unpleasant dream. You find yourself measuring the season, not by the buds on the trees or the geese overhead, but by the ink stains on Copernicus's cuffs, which seem darker and more frequent now. His sleeves are always rolled just a little higher, his hands always a little wearier. You've watched him labor over his manuscript for what feels like years. And yet, despite all your help, despite Rheticus's help, it remains unpublished. The pages are neatly stacked, the diagrams are finished. The numbers have been cross-checked until you dream in tables. But still it sits, bound only by ribbon and hesitation. Copernicus won't say it aloud, but you sense it in the way he fingers the corners of each page. How his eyes linger on the title he refuses to write with confidence. He fears what will come next, not for himself, perhaps, but for the idea. Once it leaves his study, he cannot protect it anymore. He cannot walk beside every reader and whisper, "I only meant for it to make sense." It is Rheticus who pushes hardest. The younger man has been with you for months now, too brilliant for his own safety, too impatient to accept the slow pace of cathedral life. His words are sharp, his laughter loud, and his arguments relentless. He speaks of publication as if it were salvation. The model must live outside these walls. He says again and again, it must breathe in ink and be read in voices not our own. He brings names, connections, printers he's corresponded with. He speaks of Nuremberg, where the presses are fast and the typesetters skilled. Johann Petraeus is mentioned often, a reputable man with experience handling complex mathematical works. Rheticus offers to carry the manuscript there himself, to see it through the stages of proofing and printing. He insists that the time for hesitation has passed. The world will catch up, or it won't, but it cannot do so if the pages stay hidden. Copernicus listens, quietly, thoughtfully. Then one day, without ceremony, he begins to prepare the manuscript for travel. You help organize the pages into sections. Rheticus oversees the diagrams, ensuring that none have smeared or faded. A box is found, a sturdy thing lined with wool and bits of waxed cloth. You tie the ribbons. Rheticus seals the letter. Copernicus writes the address in his usual precise hand, though you notice the way he presses too hard on the pen, as if unsure whether it's better to let the name be read clearly or fade into illegibility. The box is sent, with Rheticus riding ahead. There's no crowd to see him off. Just you and Copernicus at the cathedral gate, watching the cartwheel away down the dirt road, the manuscript swaying gently with each jolt. He's brave, Copernicus says after a long silence. You nod, but the word that comes to your mind is not brave, it's willing. And there's a difference. Weeks pass. You return to your routine. Prayers, weather logs, rent reports, minor repairs to the observatory quadrant. Copernicus begins a fresh journal. You notice he avoids mentioning the book. It's as though, having finally released it, he cannot bear to look its shadow in the eye. Then comes word from Nuremberg. Petraeus has accepted the work. The typesetting has begun. But there is a complication. With Rheticus now traveling elsewhere, summoned back to his university, or perhaps gently dismissed by Copernicus, a new figure has stepped in to shepherd the publication. His name is Andreas Osiander, a theologian, a careful man, a man who has seen the manuscript and panicked. Osiander believes the heliocentric model is dangerous, not just mathematically disruptive, but spiritually provocative. He doesn't doubt the math, but he fears its implications. And so he writes a preface, not an introduction, not a note from the printer, but a theological cushion, slipped in ahead of Copernicus's own words. In it, he suggests that the model is purely hypothetical, a useful fiction, a clever tool for calculation, but not a claim about physical reality. He does not sign the preface. The book is printed, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, a title as measured and polite as the man himself. The pages are clean. The diagrams are intact. The arguments unfold like the orbits they describe, elegant, repetitive, full of precision and gentle momentum. But it begins with a lie, a quiet one, the kind meant to shield its author, or perhaps to muffle its readers. You receive a copy weeks later. It arrives wrapped in cloth, its corners bruised by travel. You open it with hands that tremble slightly, not from fear, but from something like reverence. You turn each page slowly, seeing your own handwriting in the margins where you once copied calculations for Copernicus. And then you reach the preface. You read it once, then again, and then a third time, hoping the words will rearrange into something less cruel. He never would have written this. When you bring the book to Copernicus, he is resting in bed. He is thinner now. His breath comes slow and shallow, but he takes the book in both hands, opens it carefully, and begins to read. He does not react to the preface. He does not speak, but you watch his fingers pause ever so slightly as he turns to the first chapter. Later, after he drifts into sleep, you remain by his side, holding the book closed in your lap. It feels heavier than it should, not just from the paper, but from the burden of all that it carries: new physics, silent courage, reluctant authorship, and now, the distortion of meaning. A book that changed the sky, introduced by someone who hoped readers would not take it seriously. And yet, it is out there. The pages have been printed. The copies are being shared. The diagrams are being traced by students who will never know your names. The earth is already moving under their feet. The sun is already burning at the center. Whether they believe it or not doesn't matter anymore. The model has entered the world. It has escaped. And so, even as Copernicus's strength fades with the spring light, the world begins to shift, not quickly, not loudly, but inevitably. Not from debate or decree, but from ink. Quiet, unassuming ink. Still, before history turns its gaze to what the book meant, there is one last quiet moment to witness. The final hours of the man who dared to see the sky differently, and who watched it change while most of the world remained asleep. There is a strange quiet that settles over the chapter house in those final weeks, as though the entire cathedral has begun to hold its breath. The usual comings and goings of clergy and tenants continue, but softer somehow, subdued, as if each voice knows instinctively that someone is fading just above them. You hear fewer doors slammed, fewer boots echoing on stone. Even the bells seem to ring with a little less confidence. Outside, the Vistula is thawing. Inside, Copernicus is letting go. He remains in his upper chamber, a modest room with a small hearth, a warped table, and windows that open toward the east. The sky that once pulled him from his bed at night now watches him in silence. The quadrant gathers dust in the tower above. The daily measurements, the corrections, the long hours of tables and ratios, they've all stopped. Now there's only time, slow and unmeasured, stretching longer with each pale morning. You spend most of your hours there. At first, you're still working, hiding papers, labeling drafts, writing letters on his behalf. But gradually, the work shifts. You become a quiet presence more than an assistant, someone to refill the cup, turn the page, keep the fire from going out. He doesn't speak often now, and when he does, his voice is so faint you have to lean in close to catch it. He speaks in fragments, half equations, bits of Latin, celestial coordinates muttered, as if still trying to solve something in his dreams. The book lies nearby. De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, printed at last, bound in rough leather, smelling of ink and pressed parchment. It arrived only days ago, hand-delivered by a traveling merchant with no sense of the weight he carried. The package was simple, wrapped in cloth and twine, but when you opened it in Copernicus's presence, he looked at it for a long time before reaching out with one hand, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed the spine. No one speaks as he opens it. He flips past the title page, past the table of contents, straight into the diagrams. His eyes linger on the heliocentric model, Sun at the center, Earth a small, modest traveler in the third orbit. His lips move. No sound comes. He turns the page. Another diagram. A table. A set of calculations that look nearly identical to the ones you once helped double-check in the tower study months ago. The paper rustles softly. He continues, slowly, until the effort becomes too much. Then he sets the book aside and closes his eyes. Some say he never truly read it. Others claim he woke only long enough to hold it, then slipped away into sleep for good. But you were there. You saw how his fingers gripped the edge of the page, how his eyes traced each line as though verifying the stars one last time. If that was all he had left, it was enough. Now he sleeps more than he wakes. The fire is kept small, not for lack of fuel, but because he no longer asks for warmth. You bring water. He drinks little. Sometimes he murmurs words you don't recognize, names, perhaps, or old passages. One night, he opens his eyes just long enough to whisper, "It moves. It all moves." Then he slips back into silence, and you sit beside him, uncertain if you should answer or if he was ever truly speaking to you. When the end finally comes, it does not announce itself. It unfolds. One shallow breath, then another, then none. You are sitting at the table copying a note to a minor canon when you notice the stillness. At first, you listen for another breath. Then you cross the room, take his hand, and know. There is no drama. Just the soft fading of a man who rearranged the heavens so quietly, the stars themselves barely noticed. You close his eyes. You straighten the blanket. You leave the book where it lies, open beside him, its pages still holding the weight of his fingers. Downstairs, the bells begin to toll, not for him yet, but for the hour. You will ring them soon enough in morning. For now, you sit with him, the room lit by the last amber of the hearth, the sounds of the town carrying faintly through the shutters. The funeral is simple, modest. The other canons speak of his devotion to the church, his diligence in managing the estates, his quiet temperament. No one mentions the book. No one dares. A few know, perhaps. One of them meets your gaze during the procession and gives the smallest of nods, acknowledgement, not approval. The others say nothing. The revolution has begun, but it is not ready to be named. In the days that follow, you remain in Frauenburg, helping to settle the canon's affairs. You find old notebooks tucked behind ledgers, strange marginalia on the backs of property maps, even a diagram scratched in charcoal on the underside of a drawer. It becomes clear that what was printed in Nuremberg is only part of what he knew. There were versions, variants, scribbled experiments, calculations that contradicted even his final text, not because he doubted the sun's place, but because he never stopped refining the details. The work was always in motion, just like the heavens he studied. And as others begin to read the printed book, as scholars in Leipzig and Wittenberg and Rome begin to respond, some with curiosity, some with caution, some with contempt, you notice the same question bubbling beneath their words. They begin to wonder, was this truly all his doing? Was the book exactly as he intended? Were there others who helped shape it? Were there things left out? And that's where our next story begins. Because buried in margins, hidden in forgotten drafts and cryptic footnotes, lie the traces of another tale, the one of the scribbles, the doubts, the vanished pages, and the ink-stained whispers that shaped a sky we're still learning how to read. You don't expect to find it where you do, pressed between 2 pages of a rent register from nearly 2 decades ago, stuffed deep into a drawer of old parchment that no one has touched since the bishop's last audit. You're searching for something else entirely, a set of boundary maps for a vineyard dispute, when your hand lands on a sheet that feels different, lighter, finer. The edges curl inward, as though trying to hide from the light. You ease it out, careful not to tear it, and see at once that it doesn't belong there. It's not a ledger. It's not a letter. It's not even finished. It's a page of thought, pure, raw, unfiltered. The kind of thing you were never supposed to see. The ink is faint, brown with age and thinner in places where the neeb must have scraped the paper too fast. There are circles, arcs, half-sentences, notations in the margins that twist around the diagrams like vines. A few Latin phrases drift off into nothing. There's no title, no heading, no name. But the handwriting is unmistakable. You've seen it too many times before. Steady, neat, slightly slanted, with occasional bursts of mess when the mind raced faster than the hand. This is Copernicus, but this isn't what he sent to Nuremberg. You smooth the page out gently. The center holds a diagram, a planetary system, though not quite the one you know. The sun is there, as expected. Earth circles in the 3rd orbit, as it should, but something is different. A fine, nearly invisible line cuts across the orbits of Mars and Jupiter, connecting 2 points that aren't labeled. There's no clear purpose to it. It looks almost like a gesture, a moment of speculation that was never meant to stay. In the lower corner, written in cramped script, is the word dubium, doubt. You sit down slowly, the forgotten ledger still open on the table beside you, and begin comparing the notes to the final printed version. You've read that version so many times, you can recite entire sections. But this page, this single, rough, unnumbered page, tells another story. Some of the numbers don't match. A few orbits are drawn slightly off-center. There's a scribbled calculation in the margin that appears to test an alternate velocity for Mercury. The result has been crossed out. And then there's the ink blot. It's small, almost careless, near the top right, obscuring what might have been a phrase or a name. You wonder if it was an accident or a deliberate blot, an attempt to hide something, to erase not a number, but a moment of uncertainty. Perhaps he meant to revise the passage and never returned. Or perhaps he did return, read what he had written, and decided no one else should. You find yourself wondering how many other pages like this exist. How many moments of revision, of hesitation, of possibility, never made it into the final book. You begin to search the archive differently. You start pulling books off shelves for no better reason than their thickness or the way the bindings creak. You look behind maps, inside hymnals. You open cabinets that haven't been touched in years. And what you find are fragments. Not many, but enough. A sheet tucked into a ledger of episcopal appointments holds a variation on the diagram of Saturn's orbit. The angle slightly adjusted, the figures just shy of what appears in the published tables. A folded note stuffed into the cover of a property assessment shows what seems to be an early attempt to plot the retrograde motion of Mars without resorting to epicycles. There are no conclusions, no triumphs, just questions scrawled in the margins, tiny question marks that curve like commas, quiet admissions of uncertainty. At night, you return to your quarters and spread the sheets out under lamplight, copying what you can before the ink fades completely. The diagrams overlap. Some conflict with each other. A few look like they were drawn in frustration. Circles that go nowhere. Lines that loop aimlessly. One page where the words non sequitur are scrawled repeatedly in the top margin, as though he'd talked himself into a dead end and didn't know how to turn around. It strikes you then how fragile the revolution truly was, not just in its danger, but in its formation. These weren't declarations carved in stone. They were trials, guesses, stabs in the dark. The printed book, with its neat diagrams and measured prose, had suggested certainty. But these scraps, these chaotic, forgotten, rewritten bits, reveal something more human and perhaps more courageous, doubt paired with persistence. You start to wonder how many readers of De Revolutionimus assume it was always this clean. How many believe the final version represents the whole story? If they could see these margins, would they understand how close the model came to never existing at all? How many days Copernicus must have stared at the sky or a piece of parchment and felt only the pressure of being slightly wrong? One afternoon, you show one of the fragments to a visiting scholar from Krakow. He reads it carefully, furrows his brow, and says nothing for a long time. Then he asks, "Was this before the final model?" You nod. He sets the page down. "Then it's best left forgotten," he says. "People want clean revolutions. But that's not what this was. And you know it. This wasn't clean. It was smudged and crossed out and questioned. The sky was never handed down in perfect order. It had to be chased, cornered, scribbled into the margins of rent ledgers and weather logs and hymnals. The real revolution didn't happen in the polished copy sent to Nuremberg. It happened in these chaotic half-steps, in the sleepless nights of someone unsure if he dared write down what he saw. And so you keep searching, not for more perfect diagrams, but for imperfect ones, for doubts, for alternate attempts, because they tell a truer story. They remind you that even the clearest ideas were once muddied by indecision and fragile confidence, that even Copernicus had nights where he didn't believe his own math. You slide the page back into its hiding place for now, not out of fear, but out of respect. Some thoughts aren't meant to be read quickly. They're meant to sit quietly, waiting for someone who understands that truth often arrives in fragments. And just as you begin copying a set of strange loops from the second fragment, circles that don't match any model you've seen before, you notice something odd in the corner. A diagram that resembles the familiar heliocentric system, but labeled in a different hand. You've seen the standard diagrams so many times, they've started to feel like scripture. The sun at the center, Earth in the third orbit, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, following in tidy succession, each labeled with calm precision. Even the moons, when shown, float obediently in their assigned circles. It's neat, predictable, a model not just of the heavens, but of intellectual order. But now, laid out in front of you, are diagrams that challenge that calm, sketches that tilt sideways, that lean into uncertainty, that curve too sharply, or spiral too far. The latest one comes from the back of a theological digest. You find it hidden under a pasted binding, revealed only because the glue gave way when you dropped the book by accident. You weren't even looking for a diagram. You were trying to locate a passage on fasting practices. But there it is, scrawled in thick charcoal, as if drawn in haste or anger. At first glance, it seems familiar. You recognize the sun at the center, Earth nearby. The basic structure appears intact. But then your eyes adjust, and the differences emerge like bruises. The orbits aren't even. Some are elongated. Venus appears closer to the sun than usual, and its orbit cuts into Mercury's in a way that feels physically wrong. Jupiter's path isn't a circle at all, but a stretched oval that wanders too far west. Most unsettling of all is Saturn, whose arc stutters partway through, shifting in curvature like a diagram caught mid-correction. There are arrows, multiple ones, pointing to corrections that were never made. In the margins, a note, Optandum said non confitendum, desirable, but not to be confessed. You sit back and stare at it, wondering what compelled the sketch. Was it a test? A failed draft? Or something more daring? A moment when the circle gave way to the ellipse. In the printed De Revolutionibus, Copernicus maintains circular perfection throughout. Even when the data strains against it, he bends his numbers to fit the old aesthetic. But this diagram doesn't. It lets the planets wander. You begin to search for others like it, and you find them not many. A few tucked into collections of lecture notes. One hidden inside the flyleaf of an astrological almanac. Another drawn faintly in chalk on the underside of a loose tabletop in the Northern Archive, barely visible until you angled the lamp just right. Each one carries a quiet defiance. They don't match the published orbits. They veer. They sag. They experiment with distances that make the neat harmonies of the book feel suddenly artificial. One sketch even attempts to include the moon's motion around Earth, overlaid on Earth's own orbit of the sun. The result is a dizzying loop, a spiral within a spiral, with numbers scribbled beside it that make no immediate sense. You spend hours trying to replicate the math, tracing over the loops with a wax pencil, hoping the pattern will reveal itself. But it doesn't. It remains chaotic, as if the author gave up halfway through, exhausted by a sky that refused to behave. What's most unsettling, though, is that not all of these diagrams are in Copernicus's hand. Some are. You recognize the familiar loops of his lettering, the Latin abbreviations he favored, the occasional slanted E when he grew tired. But others, 2, maybe 3, are written differently. The spacing is looser, the ink thinner. The annotations are in a different tone, less precise, more speculative. You don't recognize the hand. At first, you think perhaps they're student copies, but the corrections made in the margins suggest otherwise. These aren't passive reproductions. They're active attempts to alter the model. One of the mystery diagrams contains an alternate configuration for the epicycle of Mars, drawn not as a small circle atop a larger orbit, but as a figure-8 loop nested within the planetary track. The math beneath it is dense, and you struggle to follow the logic. But something about the structure feels intentional, not merely decorative. Whoever drew this wasn't guessing. They were proposing. And then you find the note. A brief line, written in Latin shorthand at the bottom of the sheet. His theory is not incorrect, but it may be incomplete. It's unsigned, but it gives you pause. Incomplete. That word lingers longer than it should. If this model, so clean, so revolutionary, was incomplete, what was left out? You start to see the diagrams not as outliers, but as clues. Footnotes to a text that never got written. They're windows into a process we were never supposed to witness. Copernicus's book gave us the answer. Yes, but these fragments show the questions he never quite stopped asking. Was he aware of these alternative sketches? Did he draw some of them? Did he suppress them? Or were they left behind by others, assistants, correspondents, students, who weren't ready to give up the messy parts? You imagine the quiet conversations these pages might have inspired. Perhaps someone came to him with an alternate diagram, asking, what if it's not a circle? Perhaps he nodded, looked away, and said nothing. Perhaps he erased it later. Or perhaps he left it, folded into a book no one was supposed to open. The diagrams that don't quite fit become your obsession. You start cataloging them in a private ledger, noting which align with known models and which deviate into strange territory. Some of them correct earlier errors. Others introduce entirely new ones. But all of them share one thing in common. They point toward a world still in flux. A model not frozen in its final form, but squirming at the edges, trying to break free of old geometries. And just as you begin charting a new set of diagrams from the university's correspondence archive, you come across one with handwriting you cannot place, featuring annotations that respond to the previous sketches point for point. They are not critiques. They are clarifications. And they suggest more than just one hand had a say in the shape of Copernicus's sky, which leads you, inevitably, to wonder how many people were involved in shaping what we now think of as his alone. The diagram catches your eye before the ink has even settled. It's folded between letters that were never meant to survive this long: tithing requests, indulgence receipts, quarrels over pasture boundaries, none of which would interest a soul unless they were hunting something buried. But there it is, wedged in crooked between pages like it snuck in of its own accord. A heliocentric model, unmistakably so, but marked in a way you've never seen before. The orbits wobble ever so slightly. The circles aren't quite circular. And then you spot the giveaway. The handwriting doesn't belong to Copernicus. You don't need to be an expert to know it. The letters are longer, the strokes more playful, looping upward where Copernicus's were neat and short. Whoever drew this didn't mimic. They innovated. They had confidence, yes, but it came with an informality Copernicus never allowed himself. And in the margins, you find what could only be described as quiet rebellion. Crossed out circular orbits, redrawn paths that curve a little too wide, and Latin notes that edge toward open disagreement. One says plainly, it fits better this way, even if it pleases no one. You sit there longer than you mean to, fingers smudging the corners, eyes tracing and retracing the paths of Jupiter and Mars. Something about this model feels freer, not just in style, but in intent. It's messier, more speculative, but that mess whispers possibility. Whoever this was, they weren't just copying, they were building, revising, challenging. They understood the rules of the system, and in quiet corners, they were pushing against them. The next few weeks pass in a haze. You return to manuscripts you thought you'd exhausted, reviewing everything with new eyes. You find another strange hand in the lower margin of an astronomical chart, offering corrections so subtle you wonder how you missed them before. A slight angle adjusted here, a date scratched out and replaced, a whole column of figures written on thinner parchment, carefully inserted between thicker sheets. Always in the margins, always in ink just a shade too light, as if it didn't want to be seen unless someone knew to look. At first, you think there may be two hands, then three, perhaps more. The signs are subtle, how a certain person draws their G, the spacing between numerals, the way they annotate with little stars or curling symbols. None of it official, none of it signed. These were not students looking for credit. These were quiet collaborators, ghostly co-authors of a revolution that history remembers as the work of one man. And perhaps that's what startles you most. The book's cover says De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, Nicolaus Copernicus. Full stop. No co-author. No editor. No pen friends. Yet the margins tell a different story. They suggest long conversations held in low voices, letters passed quietly between desks, and diagrams shared in brief flashes of daring. There were debates, disagreements, possibly even arguments, folded into the pages of books that no longer exist. In one letter, unaddressed and never sent, you find the line that stops your breath. If he fears publishing it, then we must build it anyway. The writer doesn't name their subject, but the context is unmistakable. The accompanying chart mirrors Copernicus's diagrams nearly exactly, except that it abandons the perfection of circular orbits in favor of slightly elliptical paths. The language in the letter is cautious but persistent. It doesn't advocate rebellion. It simply insists that the truth, however imperfect, must be chased. You start to think of these collaborators as an invisible constellation, each one a small spark of effort orbiting the quiet sun of Copernicus's intellect. They didn't author the revolution, but they kept it alight. They prodded and poked and recalculated, not to claim credit, but because they believed the model was worth perfecting, even if it meant doing so behind closed doors. Of course, not all contributions were welcome. In one volume, a note in Copernicus's unmistakable hand reads, This cannot stand. It confuses the argument. It's written in the margin, beside a diagram where another hand, perhaps that same playful one, had introduced a looping orbital path that disrupted the geometry. You imagine the moment. A brief flicker of frustration, a quill slammed down, a correction made not in anger, but in exhaustion. These weren't disagreements of pride. They were calculations on the edge of belief. And belief was never just about the numbers. The revolution Copernicus proposed was spiritual, philosophical, and political. To say Earth move was to suggest that man was not the fixed center of creation. To suggest that, even privately, was a form of risk. For Copernicus, the shield was caution. For others, it was anonymity. Some hands were braver than others. In one odd scrap, you find a diagram that dares to plot the orbit of an unseen planet. Pure speculation, no data, only math. The writer labels it Ignis, fire. There is no commentary, no justification. Just a question mark. The paper is cheap. The ink bleeds. The thought, however, burns bright. You wonder who that person was. A student? A priest? A clerk? They vanished, but their daring flickered once. You begin to see the book not just as a printed volume, but as a silencing. Not a suppression, but a final word. One that was allowed to survive precisely because it trimmed the doubts away. The handwritten pages you find, tucked and scattered, show what the printed pages omit. Hesitation, collaboration, growth. They're not less true. They're just less finished. In your journal, you begin copying these fragments, carefully, reverently. You don't edit them. You don't smooth the numbers. You preserve the smudges, the crossed-out words, the question marks that lean like leaning trees. You even note the thickness of the ink, the texture of the paper. You don't know if anyone will ever care, but something in you insists. If this is a revolution, let it be remembered not only by its voice, but by the many hands that steadied it. And so, when you uncover one more correction, just a faint arrow drawn between two mismatched figures, with a note that reads, "Perhaps he knew. Perhaps he chose not to say." You stop for a long moment. You don't know whose hand wrote that. You may never know, but it was someone who understood that even silence can be a kind of authorship. You file the letter back in its hiding place, heart beating like you've uncovered a secret. And just as you do, a name surfaces in your memory, one of the many you skimmed past in a seemingly mundane register. A clerk, a scribe, someone who copied tables in Copernicus's later years. You remember their tidy numerals, the precise spacing. They were there, not on the cover, but in the margins. And now, with everything you've seen, you realize it's time to look even closer into the diagrams where ink fades, where geometry falters, where something almost brilliant was attempted and nearly erased. You know the charts well enough by now to feel when something's missing. A column that stops too early. An angle left undefined. An orbit that refuses to line up with its siblings, no matter how carefully you trace it. At first, you think it's simply human error, an assistant growing tired, a misaligned compass, a distraction during copying. But as the gaps multiply, it starts to feel intentional. Not carelessness, but avoidance. Someone chose not to finish. There's one diagram in particular that lingers in your mind. It's drawn on a piece of ivory-colored vellum, smooth and stiff, tucked between two theological commentaries in the bishop's private shelf. The page looks almost ceremonial, pristine margins, perfectly centered orbits, sun painted gold. But right where Mars should cross behind Earth, the line simply stops. No ink blot, no smudge, just a clean break. The planetary path hovers in mid-curve, like a thought abandoned mid-sentence. You stare at it for hours, turning it in the light, wondering if the artist ran out of time or out of courage. There's no note, no correction, just silence. And once you start looking for that silence, you see it everywhere. In one copy of De Revolutionibus, a reader has drawn faint pencil marks where corrections should be, tiny vertical lines, like notches on the edge of doubt. Elsewhere, a half-written set of planetary tables ends 2 years before it should, with the final year labeled simply pending. You find another page, folded and tucked into the back of a devotional manuscript, with a diagram of Jupiter's orbit that trails off into open space. There's no end point. It fades like a dream you weren't meant to catch. You begin cataloging these gaps, not because you expect to solve them, but because you can't stop seeing them. They aren't mistakes, they're pauses, as if the hand that held the quill knew the limits of its own reach, knew where speculation became danger, knew which stars should remain unnamed. One morning, you wake to find a new fragment has appeared on your work table, left there anonymously, slipped under your ink pots while you slept. It's a crude chart, drawn on the back of a discarded meal inventory. But on it, someone has plotted a star whose name you don't recognize. It's labeled Caligo, darkness. The coordinates are close to the orbit of Saturn, but not quite on the path. It doesn't correspond to any known body. You try to cross-reference it. You dig through catalogs, pull ancient glossaries, revisit old star maps. No match. The star doesn't exist, or not officially, which means it was seen, but not published, guessed at, but never claimed. Another gap. Another edge of the cosmos that someone once peeked into and quietly turned away from. You start to think of these moments as the negative space of the revolution. The things not said, the parts left out, the unwritten passages where someone feared being too right, too soon. It isn't just planets that orbit the sun. Doubt orbits certainty. Caution orbits discovery. The brighter the theory, the darker the gaps it leaves behind. There's a kind of reverence in that silence. Not everything needs to be filled in. Not every orbit needs a name. Some of the figures in Copernicus's tables end in ellipses, literally. 3 dots where a digit should be. You imagine him pausing, calculating, seeing the numbers diverge from expectation, and letting them go. Not because he failed, but because the model must stay intact. The risk of tampering with it was too great. You wonder what questions he asked himself in those gaps. Did he suspect the ellipses weren't right? Did he fear the circles were too neat? Did he glimpse the possibility of elliptical motion, the idea that would come decades later with Kepler, and choose deliberately not to reach that far? Historians still argue about it. Some say Copernicus never even considered ellipses, that he clung to the perfection of the circle because it was philosophically sound. Others believe he saw more than he let on, that the evidence was there, quietly suppressed to keep the work publishable. There's no definitive proof, just hints, incomplete pages, scraps of second guesses, ink trails that vanish mid-curve. And maybe that's what makes the gaps feel sacred, not as failings, but as signs of restraint. This wasn't a man who sought glory. He delayed publication for years. He resisted fame. He worked slowly, methodically, always aware of the line between curiosity and condemnation. He was bold enough to move the sun to the center of the cosmos, but not so bold as to redraw the entire map. He knew where to stop. The revolution wasn't a lightning strike. It was a slow drift, a movement carried not by trumpet blasts, but by whispered equations and careful erasures. The gaps are reminders of that caution. They tell you that even the most radical ideas are born in rooms full of doubt, that even the brightest minds pause before reaching too far. In the end, you gather the gaps into a small notebook. You label them not by what's missing, but by where they lead. Here, a missing figure in Mercury's orbit. There, a half-finished diagram of lunar motion. This one, a table that stops just short of predicting an eclipse. You don't try to complete them. You simply witness them. You let them be what they are, unfinished truths. And late one night, as candle wax pools on your desk and the stars wheel quietly above. You think back to the first chart you ever copied, the neat, perfect circles, the balance of form and function. You realize now that those charts were not the full story. The cosmos doesn't move in perfect lines. It stutters. It shifts. It leaves blank spaces. So did the revolution. And from here, we begin to ascend out of the dim candlelit rooms of scribes and silent thinkers into the lofty, brass-trimmed towers of power. Because while you've been toiling in parchment and ink, someone else has been watching the stars from above and demanding answers. You aren't even looking for it when you find it. The drawer sticks on one side, wedged slightly askew in the back of a dusty cabinet in the bishop's secondary residence, a place rarely visited, seldom swept. It's one of those rooms that still smells faintly of candle grease and old linens, with the sort of silence that feels padded, as if layered with years of unspoken instructions. You're searching for clean parchment, or perhaps a forgotten treatise on calendar reform, but instead your hand bumps against the edge of something brittle, folded, and out of place. A small bundle of pages, bound not with ribbon or seal, but with a length of string that's frayed so finely it nearly dissolves in your hands. The top sheet is unremarkable. A page of poor quality vellum, marked with a familiar planetary diagram. Earth near the bottom, sun in the center. The curved paths of the planets looping around with shaky lines and imperfect circles. A scribbled heading at the top reads, "On the harmony of the heavens revised." The last word stops you. You sit down without thinking, the chill of the stone seat forgotten, as your fingers begin to unfold the rest. It's a translation, or at least that's what it claims to be. A reworking of De Revolutionibus into a hybrid of Latin, Polish, and a sort of half-formed vernacular that seems to change from one page to the next. At first, the writing feels clumsy. Sections are shortened, paragraphs rearranged. But then, among the jumbled syntax and misshapen diagrams, you find something Copernicus's version never contained: elaboration. One section, buried between notes on Mercury's retrograde, discusses lunar parallax with a clarity that makes your jaw tighten. Another considers whether the stars are truly fixed, suggesting cautiously that they might be in motion too, just so far away that the shift is beyond measurement. But most startling of all is a paragraph midway through the text, written in a more confident hand, discussing something called nutatio orbis, a wobble of Earth's axis. Not something theorized openly in Copernicus's published works. Not something most scribes would even think to name. You glance back at the title. Revised, indeed. There's no author, no seal, no dedication. But in the margins, personal touches begin to appear. A line referencing a sympathetic bishop in Danzig. An apology, written in a narrow hand, for having taken liberties in interpretation. The phrase, "he would not approve, but I hope he would understand," appears at least twice. Whoever wrote this wasn't just translating. They were interpreting, expanding, perhaps even correcting. You imagine them working by lamplight, the manuscript of De Revolutionibus propped open beside them, frowning as they tried to make sense of the Latin, the math, the model. Maybe they were someone who had once studied under Copernicus. Maybe they were a friend, a former assistant, a student whose name never appeared in the acknowledgments. Or maybe they were simply a reader, a curious soul armed with ink, courage, and too much time alone in the winter. Some parts of the manuscript verge on speculation. You find the comet placed in a fixed orbit, drawn as a smooth spiral instead of the jagged path that reality suggests. Another page claims Saturn's orbit resonates musically, describing a low sound that echoes in dreams. Auditor insomnis, it says, heard in sleep. Is it poetic license? Is it metaphor? You can't decide. But it isn't all fanciful. Some tables contain more accurate values than those Copernicus printed. The planetary periods have been adjusted, ever so slightly, but in ways that seem eerily correct. Venus's orbit, for instance, is noted as 224.7 days, Not rounded to 225, but precise. Precise in a way no one should know without tools more advanced than any known to this century. Did they guess? Did they observe and adjust over years of charting skies from a monastery tower? Or did someone quietly pass along better data, perhaps from a scholar with access to instruments, or from coastal observers who traded notes between port cities and cathedrals? And then you find the note, folded in the back, tucked beneath a slip of cloth to protect it from ink blot. It's written in simple polish. No math, no theory, just a confession. If I have erred, I did so in admiration. If I have overreached, it was because I believed the stars would forgive me. I write not to challenge the master, but to walk beside him. You read it twice. 3 times, it doesn't feel like a student's note. It feels like a farewell. As if the writer knew this translation would never be published, never discussed, and never receive a response. It was enough, perhaps, just to do it, just to set it down. You gently refold the papers, brushing away dust with the sleeve of your robe. Part of you wants to hide them again, return them to the drawer, and let the silence reclaim them. But another part of you knows what this discovery means. It changes things. It suggests that Copernicus was not alone, not entirely. That his revolution echoed into smaller rooms and quieter voices, some that dared to whisper back. Perhaps that's what revolutions really are. Not thunderclaps, but echoes. Not declarations, but revisions. Not shouted manifestos, but hidden manuscripts, waiting in drawers for hands like yours to pull them into light. As you rise, you hear footsteps above, not soft ones this time, measured, decisive. Not the pace of curious scribes, but of men who fund observatories, who own brass instruments polished to gleam, who ask questions not out of wonder, but for calculation. Because upstairs, the sky has a different audience now. One that pays for predictions. One that listens only when the stars speak in polished, pleasing tones. And as your hand closes the drawer, you prepare to enter that world, where astronomy becomes performance, and accuracy is only as welcome as its political timing. You spread the last of the manuscripts across the table, but you don't even need to read them anymore. The patterns have burned themselves into your mind, the shapes of loops, the corrections in ash-colored ink, the faint indentations where a compass is pressed too hard. You've begun to recognize the weight of a smudge, the angle of a slip, the particular shake of a hand that hesitated before committing a number to parchment. Theories here weren't always built from clarity. Sometimes they emerged from accidents, from miscalculations corrected too late, from errors that pointed, inadvertently, toward something more accurate than the intention behind them. There's one smudge in particular that you've come to know like an old friend. It's shaped like a thumbprint, pressed into a page of planetary tables. You noticed it weeks ago, a pale gray blot that obscures the final digit in a sequence tracking Saturn's position. At first, you tried to erase it gently with a soft cloth. Then, thinking better of it, you traced around the smudge instead, trying to reconstruct what it was hiding. The number should have been a 2, based on Copernicus's earlier notations. But when you apply the 2, the math falters. The orbit collapses. Only when you try a 5, accidentally, while scratching a rough note, do the figures align again. Not just cleanly, but almost perfectly. You stare at the page for a long time, wondering, did someone smudge the number on purpose? Did a scribe try to erase it? Or was it simply the imprint of a tired hand, leaning on fresh ink? That single mark makes the entire model stronger, more consistent. But it's born of imperfection. And you're starting to think that the revolution always was. The polished diagrams in the published De Revolutionibus suggest certainty. Circles neat and centered. Labels arranged with pride. But the working pages, the ones hidden in drawers, folded behind missals, stuffed between commentaries, tell another story. There, you see theories revised mid-sentence. notes written sideways in the margins, tables that grow increasingly frantic across the page, as if the writer were chasing a thought they feared would vanish before they could catch it. Sometimes the ink bleeds right through, ghosting the next page with phantom orbits. You've begun cataloging these inconsistencies, not as mistakes, but as part of the story. Each blot, each crossed-out line, each orphaned calculation that leads nowhere, they're footprints. Evidence that the cosmos wasn't cracked open in a single burst of genius, but chipped at over years by candlelight, by ink that smeared too easily, by eyes that squinted through sleep and cold. It makes the knowledge feel human, fallible, alive. In one particularly chaotic set of notes, you find a margin scribble that reads, "This works better, though I can't explain why." The author is anonymous. The handwriting, rushed and smaller than the main body, suggests they didn't expect anyone to notice. And yet here you are, centuries later, taking that small confession and running it through your own calculations. And you discover they were right. It does work better. There's humility in that honesty, an admission that sometimes understanding comes after the fact, that even when the numbers fail, the intuition might still hold. These were men and women who didn't have the benefit of precision instruments or modern formulas. They had parchment, star charts, and a hope that the night sky would reward their persistence. You begin to wonder how many breakthroughs in this so-called revolution were not the product of brilliance, but of stubbornness, of someone refusing to accept that a number didn't fit and redoing the entire table until it did, or of someone like you, staring at a blotch and letting it live there long enough to become meaningful. There's a theory in one of the more fragmented documents that suggests the moon's orbit might not be a perfect oval, but instead a sort of swaying path, neither ellipse nor circle, but something in between. The model is messy, the math inconsistent, but when you sketch it out in the sand behind the residence one night, using a stick and your own breath as a compass, the path looks surprisingly natural, like something organic, alive. You begin to think, maybe our desire for perfection was always the flaw. Maybe the heavens were never tidy. Maybe the beauty was in their strangeness. Historians still debate how much Copernicus knew, and how much he chose not to include. Did he see elliptical motion and set it aside? Did he entertain the wobble of Earth and quietly dismiss it as too dangerous to print? Theories have grown from those omissions, like vines around a stone. The less he said, the more we imagined. Whole books have been written to explain a sentence he left unfinished. Whole careers devoted to explaining the footnotes he never wrote. And yet, even those speculations are built on smudges, interpretations of faint marks, partial copies, and inconsistent second-hand translations. The revolution was never just one book. It was 100 messy drafts, 1,000 offhand comments, a night sky observed and misremembered, then argued over in taverns and libraries. It wasn't born of brilliance alone, but of community. Not a community that could meet in the open, but one that left fingerprints for each other to find. You think of the translator's note again, the one you found in the drawer. I write not to challenge the master, but to walk beside him. That's what most of these authors were doing. Walking beside Copernicus, not ahead, not behind. Matching pace, offering a hand, pointing out a missed step now and then. And you? You've spent your weeks, maybe months now, walking beside them, tracing their thoughts, watching their errors turn into insight, following the marks they left behind, the same way sailors follow stars, knowing the light they see is already old. One night, as you're sorting yet another stack of corrections, you notice that someone's written a list of numbers along the spine of a loose-leaf folio. It looks like nothing at first, a column of digits. But when you recognize the pattern, your heart starts to race. It's a trigonometric table, more accurate than any Copernicus published. No title, no attribution. But the implications are clear. Someone improved on the model, quietly, anonymously. likely afraid to share it. The page has a tea stain in one corner. The ink has bled through the middle. But it works. It fits. The universe, once again, rearranged by hands no one remembers. And just like that, it's time to leave. You've spent long enough among the scribes and secret scholars, the drawers and the dust, the margins and the doubts. The revolution has done its whispering. The page is nearly full. Now it's time to climb. Because high above you, in observatories with burnished lenses and gold leaf armillary spheres, the nobles and bishops are waiting. They don't want doubts. They want predictions. They don't want smudges. They want stars that stay where they're told. You're no longer in the realm of speculation. You are stepping into a world where astronomy must prove itself useful, or risk being dismissed with the morning fog. The first thing you notice when entering the upper chamber isn't the books, or the instruments, or even the view. It's the ceiling, painted from corner to corner in a dark blue lacquer that shimmers faintly under the morning light. It's a map of the heavens as imagined, not as charted. Stars are scattered across the plaster in neat, symmetrical constellations, each outlined with gilded strokes, their figures more mythical than accurate. The constellations look down at you like frescoed gods, proud, decorative, unbothered by epicycles. You tilt your head to study them and instantly feel the difference. This is not the sky you've been working under. This is a curated sky, a sky that has never known a smudge or a rushed calculation. It's perfectly aligned with the room's geometry, not with the cosmos. Each celestial lion hunter and serpent placed to please the patron's sense of symmetry rather than the star's actual coordinates. In this sky, everything fits, everything gleams, and everything stays where it's told. The patron enters not long after you do. He moves like a man who's never needed to rush, slow, deliberate, always at the center of the room, even when he's near the edge. His robe is thick with embroidery, and the chain around his neck is heavy enough to anchor a ship. But his eyes are sharp. Not cruel, not yet, but focused in a way that leaves little room for hesitation. He doesn't ask you what you've discovered. He asks only if you've brought results. And you have. You produce your notes, carefully organized. Your diagrams, rewritten neatly. Your calculations, double-checked and transcribed into a hand that won't embarrass your employer. He looks at them for exactly 6 seconds before asking how they compare with the church's accepted calendar. You offer a cautious answer, close, but not quite, and feel the room chill half a degree. Because this, you realize, is not a place for close. This is a place where astronomy must serve, where it must confirm feast days, guide ceremonies, and flatter horoscopes. The sky here is not something to question. It's something to package, to present, to display like a crown jewel. He leads you to his study, where a brass armillary sphere stands near the window, polished to a mirror shine. The rings are etched with Latin and Greek, spinning smoothly when he nudges them with a single finger. He speaks fondly of Ptolemy. He names stars not by number or distance, but by the gods they once resembled. He shows you a recent commission, a fresco meant to decorate the cathedral's apse, with the sun at the center, flanked by angels and saints holding telescopes they absolutely would not have had. It is beautiful. It is utterly, magnificently wrong. And this, too, is part of your job now. Not to correct the fresco, but to nod politely, to suggest small adjustments, never wholesale revisions. You learn quickly how to temper the truth, to package each correction in the velvet glove of flattery. You don't say, the data disagrees. You say, what an intriguing interpretation. The truth must be domesticated, tamed. The kind of astronomy practiced in these rooms has more in common with tapestry weaving than with science. It must match the furniture. It must be legible from across the room. Above all, it must make the patron feel wise for having chosen to fund it. So you adjust your language. You stop saying heliocentric. You say alternate modeling. You stop mentioning Copernicus's name unless you're asked. And even then, you keep it brief. You focus instead on predictability, on usefulness. You emphasize how your tables will allow for more accurate harvest festivals and smoother scheduling of high feasts. You don't mention that they might also suggest Earth is not still. That part you keep in your pocket. The library upstairs holds more scrolls than you could ever read, but half are filled with interpretations of dreams, royal genealogies aligned with celestial events, and records of eclipses used to justify wars. There's value in that, cultural, political, but it's a far cry from your smudged charts and incomplete diagrams. These books want certainty. They want stars that obey. At night, when the patron has retired to prayer or supper, you sneak back to the observatory on the roof. It's not much, just a small circular platform with a quadrant mounted to the wall. But from here, you can see the real stars again, the imperfect ones, the ones that drift a little, the ones that shimmer through humidity and disappear behind clouds. You plot them quietly, away from the ceiling's symmetrical constellations, away from the armillery's golden rings, and you begin to feel two skies forming in your mind. There's the ceiling sky, the sky of patrons and bishops, polished and controlled, pressed into myths and predictions. It's the sky that's safe to speak of, that earns funding, that doesn't scare the clergy. Then there's your sky, the one you share with the scribes and with Copernicus and with whoever it was that hid the revised manuscript in the drawer. It's not orderly, it's not always comforting, but it's real, and it's just barely peeking through the plaster above your head. You wonder how many others feel the same. How many scholars sit beneath painted stars and dream of the ones they're not allowed to mention. How many theories have been drafted, folded, and quietly burned when they didn't match the ceiling. Even as you stand in this fine chamber, with its velvet curtains and scented coals, you feel the ink stains on your hands, ghosts of calculations that didn't please anyone. You think of all the data points smudged, corrected, or discarded to protect the patron's dignity. And you begin to understand that in places like this, astronomy must dress for the occasion. Still, when the meeting ends and the papers are approved, you return to your modest room with its slanted window and drafty walls. And before you sleep, you take out your own charts, less pretty, less precise, but honest. The numbers aren't symmetrical. The diagrams are smeared in the margins, but they are yours. And somewhere, across the rooftops and chapel domes, the stars continue to move. Not in circles, not in harmony, but in motion nonetheless. You press your candle closer to the page. There's still work to do, still questions to whisper, still truths to hide beneath diagrams pleasing enough for the ceiling, but sharp enough to cut through it if read the right way. Because as the sun rises and your next appointment with your patron looms, you begin to realize something unsettling. They may hold the telescope, but you still hold the ink. You're beginning to understand that not all stargazing is done with the intention of uncovering the truth. Sometimes it's done to maintain a carefully composed illusion. The bishop's study has become a kind of second observatory, though the stars considered here are less concerned with orbits and more with omens. The latest request is a familiar one. He wishes to know whether the heavens favor his niece's upcoming wedding, and though the question is dressed in polite theology, it's clear he expects a pleasant answer. As you unroll your star charts and sift through recent planetary positions, you notice he has already had an artist gild the parchment corners with cherubs and roses. There's no space left for doubt. You answer delicately, pointing out Venus's current position and its association with peace and harmony. You note that the moon will be waxing, which is widely considered a good sign. You mention Jupiter's benign influence on familial unions, though you carefully omit that the alignment is less than ideal by Copernican reckoning. The bishop beams at your explanation and orders a servant to record the date with ceremonial flourish. As the ink dries on the announcement, You watch your carefully prepared figures fade into the background, reduced to footnotes beneath the gold leaf symbolism. It becomes clear, after only a few weeks, that your role has shifted. You are no longer merely a student of the heavens, but also a decorator of earthly hopes. Word spreads quickly, and before long, you are summoned not just by the bishop, but by a rotating cast of barons, merchants, and clergymen, each eager for celestial affirmation. One wishes to know whether the stars support a new trade route. Another hopes for confirmation that a recent illness is only temporary misfortune, not a sign of divine displeasure. A nobleman quietly asks whether the child recently born to his household bears the markings of future greatness, and you are expected to read his chart with tact, no matter the result. In each case, you find yourself walking a fine line. The truth is rarely welcome in these circles, unless it can be made attractive, softened, or fitted within the accepted frameworks of belief. You choose your words carefully, wrapping each observation in language that sounds authoritative but remains vague enough to be interpreted favorably. Phrases like auspicious influence and favorable positioning serve you well. You learn quickly that reassurance is a far more valuable commodity than accuracy. Your reputation grows, and with it comes a degree of access that would once have been unthinkable. You are invited to private libraries, granted time with rare manuscripts, and even given the chance to examine instruments rumored to have come from Venice or Prague. Some of them are finely crafted, impressive to behold, but used more for display than discovery. They gleam beneath stained glass windows and sit untouched for weeks, ornaments of intellect rather than tools of inquiry. The nobility speak of astronomy with a kind of casual reverence, but it becomes apparent that their understanding of the sky is rooted more in symbolism than in motion. For them, a comet is not a celestial object on a long elliptical path, but a message. A horoscope is not a pattern of probabilities, but a promise. And yet you comply. You continue your quiet calculations at night, scratching figures beneath candlelight, hiding your more daring conclusions between sheets of innocuous predictions. You do not speak openly of Copernicus anymore. The memory of his manuscript still lingers, but here, surrounded by marble floors and perfumed courtyards, it feels more like myth than method. When pressed, you mention the models only in the most academic of terms, always careful to frame them as alternate conceptions, never threats to the accepted view. You're learning to protect the work by disguising it, to keep the revolution safe behind layers of politeness and passive voice. One day, a high-ranking cleric requests a forecast for the coming year. You bring your papers, your charts, and your polished brass compass, expecting to walk through a modest list of dates. Instead, he offers you a sheet already filled with events, feasts, appointments, and announcements, and asks whether the stars support the plans already in place. You understand, in that moment, that you are not there to interpret the sky. You are there to ratify the calendar. You nod, speak favorably of Saturn's position, and make minor adjustments where it seems appropriate. But the outcome is predetermined. The stars, in this room, are required to be obedient. It is during these visits that you begin to see how fragile the truth can become when draped in too many layers of decoration. A prediction, once made in confidence and caveat, is repeated without context. A tentative chart becomes a certainty once it is copied onto parchment with the bishop's seal. Slowly, you find yourself watching your own words detach from their meanings, floating into the public record as elegant but hollow affirmations. You try to remember that behind the ceremonies, there is still real work being done. Tables still improved, alignments still observed, theories still evolving, but it grows harder to keep the two worlds from blurring together. Still, you continue. You continue because the stars are still there, just as they were when you first traced them through a frost-covered window, just as they were when you leaned over Copernicus's drafts in the silence of an archive. They remain untouched by the rituals below, no matter how many feasts they are asked to endorse. No matter how many marriages they are summoned to bless, the stars remain faithful only to their motion. They neither flatter nor condemn. They simply move. At night, when the palace has gone quiet and your duties are done, you slip away to your narrow chamber and unfold the papers no one asks for anymore. The tables you adjust by hand, the diagrams you correct with patience, the uncelebrated models that don't draw applause, but edge ever closer to something real. You study them in silence, letting the weight of your other predictions fall away. Because while others may need their stars to whisper blessings, you still listen for truth. And soon, that quiet search will lead you into the final chamber, the one filled with lenses so rare they are kept behind locked doors, the one said to offer a clearer view of the sky than any ceiling or ceremony ever could. You've been invited to step inside it tomorrow, and for once, they are not asking for a prediction. They are asking for proof. The staircase leading to the observatory is narrow and curved, lit only by small arrow-slit windows that cast long fingers of light across the cold stone steps. Each footfall echoes slightly ahead of you, bouncing up into the chamber you have yet to see. The servant who guides you says nothing, only gestures when you reach the landing, then disappears the moment the heavy door swings open. You step into the silence, and at first, all you see is glass. It glints in the dim light like a scattered constellation. Lenses of every size arranged on polished wooden tables, prisms hanging from brass hooks, tubes of varying lengths laid out like delicate weapons. The air smells faintly of oiled wood and cold iron. This is not the decorative astronomy of courtly murals or golden armillary spheres. This is something stripped of ornament, not hidden exactly, but carefully removed from the eyes of those who don't know what they're looking at. The chamber is circular, its high ceiling fitted with a mechanical dome that can open in panels, though at the moment it remains shut. A small wood stove ticks gently in the corner, giving off a warmth that doesn't quite reach the center of the room. You move slowly, not wanting to disturb anything. Even the dust here seems arranged with purpose. At the far end stands a long, low bench stacked with notebooks. No bindings, no covers. Just page after page of loose parchment, weighed down by stones and instruments. Most of the handwriting is unfamiliar. Some is faint with age. A few bare diagrams so precise you momentarily forget they were drawn by hand. You pause before a folio half buried under a glass quadrant and recognize something familiar, the peculiar curve of a planetary path, the asymmetrical spacing between the outer planets. It's not one of your drawings, but it follows the same logic. Someone else has seen what you've seen. There is a quiet click behind you, and then a portion of the ceiling splits open, revealing a narrow view of the sky. It is mid-morning, the sun just high enough to cast a bright oval of light onto the tiled floor. Dust dances in the beam. You're not sure who triggered the opening. Perhaps it was automated. Perhaps you were expected. The instrument nearest the window is older than you imagined. Its wood is dark and knotted, but the fittings are meticulous. You adjust it slightly, unsure whether you're allowed to touch it, and tilt the lens toward the light. Through it, the sky resolves into a blinding blue and then into blur. A gentle twist of the brass dial sharpens the focus, and suddenly you see it, a pale white arc, so faint it might vanish with a breath. Venus, just beyond the sun's reach, barely visible by day. You stand motionless, holding your breath, unsure whether the image will remain. And it does. Not a symbol, not a blessing, not a prediction. Just a planet, in its place, silent and steady. You are not seeing it as Copernicus did. You are seeing it more clearly. The tools have improved. The models have guided the instruments. The math, flawed and corrected over years, has pointed to this moment of clarity. Around the chamber, there are signs of others. A half-finished gear mechanism tucked into the base of a wall. A celestial globe etched with recent corrections. papers bearing initials that don't appear in the official histories. This observatory is a secret, but it is not empty. Someone uses it. Perhaps many have over the years. Perhaps each was drawn here by the same quiet longing to see something that wasn't meant to be decorative or reassuring, but real. You find yourself imagining the others. Not patrons or priests, but assistants, scribes, curious minds who began with borrowed manuscripts and ended up building instruments from scavenged brass. They would have spoken softly, if at all. They would have worked at odd hours, revisiting the same calculations again and again, measuring discrepancies that no one else considered important. They would have known how to explain what they were doing, and also when to keep it to themselves. The quiet here is not just absence. It feels chosen, protected. There are no grand speeches or dramatic unveilings. There is just the rhythm of gears, the whisper of turning pages, and the occasional groan of the dome as it shifts to follow the light. You could stay here all day and never be interrupted. No servants bring refreshments. No visitors arrive uninvited. It is not hidden by prohibition, but by indifference. No one looks for heresy where there is no spectacle. You return to the bench and study one of the more recent drawings, a solar path plotted with astonishing precision, the notations clean and even. You realize with a small start that it adjusts for atmospheric refraction, something only a few minds in the entire region would even consider relevant. Whoever made this drawing was not merely observing, they were refining. This is not a temple to Copernicus, but an extension of his vision, beyond the manuscript, beyond the cautious first steps. In the corners of the room, hourglasses sit beside candle stubs, and their positioning suggests deliberate experiments. A chart near the window appears to correlate planetary positions with tiny fluctuations in shadow length. Tests of consistency, perhaps, or just the obsessive documentation of a restless mind. You trace your finger along the margin and find a faint mark. If true, repeat on solstice. It's not dated. It doesn't need to be. The sky keeps its own calendar. No one speaks as you work. No one hurries you along. There is a peace in this room unlike any other you've known, not the ceremonial peace of chapel music or the superficial calm of noble courtyards, but a deeper stillness. It is the quiet of exactitude, the silence that follows real understanding, the absence of confusion. Once in orbit finally makes sense. You stay longer than planned. You take notes. You make no predictions. You write nothing for public eyes. Just slow, careful measurements in a room that seems built for them. When the dome finally closes again, and the daylight narrows to a soft glow, you pack your papers without rush. You feel no need to speak as you descend the staircase. Outside, the palace is waking. Servants sweep the walkways. Horses are being saddled. A messenger calls out over the courtyard wall. But as you step back into the day, the noise seems thinner, the motion less urgent. You've spent your morning in a place where time works differently. And as you walk slowly back to your chamber, your hands still warm from the sunlit lens, you carry a single thought with you. There is a silence more powerful than praise. And tomorrow, if no one stops you, you'll return to it. The invitation arrives in the early afternoon, hand-delivered on parchment thick enough to serve as kindling. Its edges are trimmed in gold leaf, and the wax seal bears the unmistakable crest of a nearby nobleman, one of the bishop's oldest associates, whose appetite for astrology has recently begun to rival his taste for venison and imported wines. The message is brief but precise. You are cordially invited to attend a private supper on the eve of the eclipse. Your presence is requested not only as a guest, but as a learned interpreter of celestial matters. A seat has been reserved, and your acceptance assumed. You know better than to decline. Publicly, the eclipse is treated as a curiosity, perhaps even a divine reminder. Privately, there is nervous energy in the air, the kind that settles between teeth and tightens the corners of conversation. The event is uncommon, and its timing near the turning of the season, just days before a planned political announcement, has raised more than a few brows. To you, the alignment is predictable, calculated weeks ago with careful figures and tabulated tables. To others, it feels ominous. As the sun begins to sink, you dress with restraint. Not the scholar's robe you wear in study, nor the plain tunic suitable for climbing ladders in the observatory. Tonight requires something in between. You choose a dark doublet, one that speaks of quiet knowledge without drawing too much attention. You carry no charts, no tools, no papers, just memory and caution. The supper is held in the upper hall of the nobleman's estate, a long room paneled with oak and softly glowing with candlelight. Windows have been shuttered in advance, not against the cold, but against distraction. A servant nods as you enter and guides you to your place at the table. You are seated between a young court secretary, who smells faintly of ink and nerves, and a widowed countess who greets you with a smile that doesn't quite reach her eyes. Conversation begins pleasantly enough. There is talk of harvest yields, of the latest hymnals from Prague, of a new breed of horse favored in Hungary. But it is clear from the glances sent your way, from the small pauses after each course, that everyone is waiting for the same subject to surface. You take a sip of wine, hold your tongue, and let it come on its own. It arrives, inevitably, in the form of a question disguised as flattery. "We are fortunate," says the nobleman from the head of the table, raising his glass, "to dine tonight with one who understands the sky's deeper meanings. Tell us, if you would, what we should expect from this particular eclipse." The room quiets just slightly. Forks pause. A servant drops a ladle in the distance, and even that clang seems rehearsed. You place your cup gently on the table and answer with practiced calm. You explain that the eclipse will be partial in this region, most visible in the early morning hours. You mention the moon's path, the sun's angle, the calculations involved in predicting its arc. You keep your voice even, your pace steady. But then comes the second question. And its meaning? This one is harder to answer. Not because you lack an opinion, but because every possible reply is a door. Say too little, and they assume you're hiding something. Say too much, and they hear only what confirms their fears. You choose your words carefully. You say eclipses are natural, observable, recurring. You mention that the ancients once feared them, but now we know better. You avoid any suggestion of omen, yet still, the room shifts. The countess beside you leans in and whispers that her late husband passed under an eclipse just like this. The secretary asks whether Saturn's proximity might amplify its effects. Another guest wonders if the king's advisors have consulted anyone. A priest clears his throat and says softly that even St. Augustine wrote of eclipses as reminders of human frailty. The nobleman nods, his fingers steepled, and asks what Copernicus would have thought. The question hangs for a moment, longer than it should. You consider the answer carefully. You could say Copernicus would have measured it, that he would have noted the discrepancy in timing between older models and his own, that he would have seen it not as a warning, but as a confirmation. But you also know what they want, something softer, something that lets them finish their wine without unease. So you offer both. You say that Copernicus believed in the order of the heavens, in the predictability of motion, that such events, though rare, serve as reminders not of chaos, but of structure. You say that eclipses, in their mystery, have always prompted reflection, that they ask questions more than they answer them. The nobleman smiles and lifts his cup again. The tension, while not gone, loosens. The conversation shifts to less dangerous ground. You're thanked for your insight. Dessert is served, figs soaked in wine, spiced pears, and sweet almonds. The music resumes, and you are, for the moment, safe. But as the supper winds down and guests drift into smaller groups, you catch whispers in the hallway. A mention of the calendar reform still under debate. A speculation about whether eclipses signal unrest in Rome. A quiet word about Copernican, Circles being discussed more openly in certain libraries. It's not fear, exactly, but something adjacent to it, like the feeling just before a storm, when the leaves turn up and the birds go quiet. When you finally step outside into the cool night, the sky is cloudless. The stars are bright, but the moon is missing part of its face already. You tilt your head and watch as the Earth's shadow eats slowly across its surface, darkening it into something uncertain and unfinished. Around you, the estate is silent, though behind shuttered windows, you know some are still watching, some are still wondering. And you, walking slowly back toward your lodgings, think again of the observatory dome, of the quiet papers, of the gears ticking softly beneath the bench. The eclipse is not a judgment. It is not a curse or a sign. It is just motion made visible. Still, tomorrow, when the bishop summons you again, you will be asked for explanations. But the ones that matter are the ones no one will request. The ones that lie ahead, still forming on your page. Midnight arrives quietly, with no grand signals, no tolling bells, only the subtle press of silence that deepens when the rest of the world withdraws. You feel it not as an hour, but as a weight in the air, a hush that slides into the halls and presses gently against the windows. The palace has settled into sleep, and even the servants move like ghosts through distant corridors, their footsteps softened by rugs and routine. But you remain awake, too full of thought, too full of unfinished figures to even attempt rest. So, you do what you've always done in these moments of restlessness. You return to your desk. Your chamber is narrow and dim, just enough space for a cot, a desk, and the overburdened shelf that sags under the weight of your worn manuscripts. The hearth has long since burned down to coals, and though the embers still give off a faint warmth, it doesn't reach your fingers. You don't mind. Cold sharpens you. You light a small beeswax candle, shielding the wick from a draft as it sputters to life. Its flickering light spills over your papers, casting long shadows that shift with your breath. Here, in this low glow, the work looks different. The ink feels more permanent, the errors more personal. You take your seat, rubbing your hands together briefly, and pull the most recent sheet toward you. It's the epicycle corrections for Mars, again. The looping, maddening path of that red wanderer continues to defy easy simplification. The old Ptolemaic model fails it. Even Copernicus's calculations, improved as they are, leave a few residual smudges of uncertainty. So you sharpen your quill and begin tracing the arc once more, eyes flicking between the number columns and the diagram. The orbit is close, so tantalizingly close, but off by enough to gnaw at your confidence. It's not the kind of mistake anyone else would notice, but you would. As you work, time dissolves. There is no ticking clock in the room, no striking hour to anchor you. Only the slow drift of wax melting down the side of your candle and the increasingly smudged side of your hand where it drags across the parchment. Outside the window, a frost begins to bloom on the glass, delicate and slow, forming patterns not unlike the orbital sketches you've drawn 100 times. You glance up once, watching it spread, and wonder if anyone else is awake in the building. Perhaps a sentry on the rampart. Perhaps another student like you, hunched in some other dark room, working by candlelight on a problem they can't let go of. You return to the work, slowly redrawing a segment of the planetary loop, recalculating each angle with aching care. You consult your older notes, your revised calendar estimates, even a scribbled margin where you once questioned whether a fluctuation in brightness might correlate with orbital eccentricity. The ink is faded there. You pause, gently retracing the line, not to correct it, but to reassert its place in your memory. Each scrap of note holds meaning here, each correction another piece of the long mosaic you've been assembling for months. Somewhere behind you, a wooden beam groans softly. The building settles deeper into the night, embracing its stillness. The sound does not interrupt your concentration. If anything, it affirms it. You have grown used to working through these sounds. The creak of ancient joints, the whisper of wind against stone, the occasional muffled step from a floor above. This nocturnal orchestra, familiar and calming, becomes your accompaniment. It plays only for the sleepless. You pause to stretch your shoulders, rolling them back until your spine cracks gently. Your fingers are ink-stained, your knuckles stiff, but your mind is alight with possibility. You've corrected the arc again, and this time the alignment feels smoother. You test it against past oppositions. The curve holds. It isn't perfect, nothing is, but it hums more evenly now, like a gear that's finally meshing as it should. You make a small notation in the corner of the page, not with pride, but with relief. The kind of quiet satisfaction no one will applaud, but which tastes better than wine. You remember something Copernicus once wrote in a margin, not in De Revolutionibus, but in a personal letter, half in Latin, half in Polish. He said that the truth was not loud, but stubborn, that it returned in the quiet moments like a tide, that sometimes all one could do was listen for its coming and be ready to recognize it when it arrived. You think of that now, smiling faintly, as you slide one sheet aside and begin another. Tonight, the tide is in. You lose track of time again. The candle has burned low, and the flame dances lower in its wax basin. Your eyes sting, but not with exhaustion, more with the strain of chasing something just at the edge of certainty. You dip your quill again and continue. This page is a cross-reference of lunar irregularities, intended to resolve a debate no one else seems interested in. But you care, not because you seek to challenge the church, not because you wish your name to stand beside those of Copernicus or Ptolemy. You care because the model should work, because the sky is more than metaphor, because you have seen it whisper truth through motion. At some point, the candle gutters, and the flame shivers itself out. You sit for a while in the dark, letting your eyes adjust. Moonlight slips between the shutters in slivers, and the frost on the window pane catches it like tiny mirrors. You place your quill aside, flex your fingers, and allow yourself a rare moment of stillness. The corrections are not finished. They never truly are. Each refinement opens a dozen new questions. But tonight, something has shifted. The numbers fit just a little more snugly. The math sighs with relief, instead of groaning with contradiction. And even though you know no one will ask to see these pages, you preserve them carefully. One day, perhaps they'll find their way to someone else's desk. Someone who reads the numbers with the same hunger, the same tired eyes, the same quiet hope. As you prepare for sleep, you tidy the papers, aligning each corner with care. The ink is dry, the figures rest. You place a stone on top to keep the wind from scattering them if the window rattles open. You do not write your name. You do not need to. The work speaks for itself, if anyone ever thinks to listen. And tomorrow, there will be one more task, one last commission to fulfill, not from the stars, but from someone with power and a question they may not want answered. The candle is gone, the ink has dried, and somewhere behind your closed eyes, the sky is already shifting. You wake not to the clang of bells or the scrape of shutters, but to a thinner kind of silence, the kind that knows it will soon be broken. There is a coolness in the room that touches the bones before the mind registers it, and you sit up slowly, blinking against the bluish murk that has replaced the deep black of night. You are still in your clothes, one boot half pulled off, a blanket tossed across your knees, sometime before the candle guttered out. You don't remember lying back. You only remember numbers. The corner of the room where you left your work still breathes with quiet tension. Even in the half-light, you can see the edge of the page you left exposed. The final correction made with trembling fingers just before you drifted into a slouched sleep. You cross the room, joints protesting with every step, and run your hand lightly across the stack. The ink is dry. The calculations, despite their lateness and the cold, hold firm. You feel it again, That faint tug of reassurance. Not pride, exactly. Just the soft awareness that the sky did what it was supposed to. And for once, your math kept up with it. You cracked the shutters open just a little. The outside world is still mostly gray, lit by the early light that has yet to find its voice. There's a faint crust of frost on the iron hinges, and the street beyond is nearly empty, save for a boy delivering firewood and an old woman sweeping her threshold with an oversized broom. The stars have gone, swallowed one by the creeping blush of day. What had felt endless just hours ago now slips quietly behind a veil, not gone, but unreachable until night returns. You dress more carefully than usual. There is a meeting this morning, and not the kind where you can slouch behind a manuscript and nod occasionally. The bishop has summoned you. A formal consultation. He has questions, likely harmless ones about the eclipse or the nobleman's anxious supper guests. Or perhaps less harmless ones, if word has traveled faster than you hoped. You tie your outer robe snugly, lace your boots tight, and slide your latest tables into a leather satchel, careful not to crease the pages. You leave behind the more dangerous ones, the sheets with revised orbital models and tiny notes referencing Copernicus's unpublished diagrams. Those remain tucked in the drawer under your desk, folded between harmless-looking church calendars and the scribbled beginnings of a star catalog you may never finish. The stairs down to the courtyard are still coated with a thin film of frost, and you take them slowly, one hand trailing the wall. In the dim morning air, everything feels muffled. Your footsteps, the sound of doors opening in the distance, even the birdsong seems tentative. The sun is just beginning to clear the rooftops, painting the chimneys with pale gold that doesn't yet bring warmth. The town is stretching itself awake, cautiously. You pass a baker rolling open his shutters, and a boy chasing a dog with a stick. You nod to them both. Neither nods back. As you approach the bishop's residence, the air grows warmer, if not literally then in tone. The walls here are clean, recently swept. The garden hedges are trimmed into careful spirals. A pair of guards stand at the entrance, not to menace, but to remind. You greet them with the small bow you've practiced, respectful but not deferential, and they step aside. The heavy door opens inward, releasing a rush of incense and the scent of fresh pine laid across the floor to absorb the morning's dampness. A steward, younger than you and far more polished, motions for you to follow. You walk the familiar path, across the main hall, past the row of carved saints, under the painted ceiling that depicts a night sky in which every star shines from exactly the wrong place. You don't point this out. You never do. The bishop's study is warmer still, filled with tapestries and candlelight, as if determined to hold the night just a little longer. He sits at a table laden with scrolls, correspondence, and a plate of carefully peeled apples. He gestures for you to sit. You do. The conversation begins politely. He asks about the eclipse, its timing, its behavior, whether it matched your expectations. You nod. You give him the numbers he wants. You produce the clean, orderly tables, and he skims them without real interest. He asks about the nobleman's dinner, if the guests were reassured. You choose your words with care. He seems pleased. But then comes the real reason you're here. He leans back slightly, steeples his fingers, and asks what you make of the recent speculations. There's no name given, but you know who he means. The murmurs about Copernican circles. The whispers that some students, not you, of course, surely not you, have begun exploring less traditional models. You respond as you've rehearsed. You say that such ideas remain speculative, interesting in their mathematics, but not proven in their theology. That even Copernicus himself delayed publishing out of caution, humility, perhaps even respect. You mention harmony, balance, obedience. You sprinkle the air with all the phrases that smell like safety. The bishop listens. He nods. He does not smile. By the end of the meeting, You are not certain if you've been dismissed or tolerated, but either way, you gather your satchel and bow. The steward escorts you back through the warm halls, down the stone steps, and out into the new morning. The air bites now, the frost giving way to a thin sheen of melting. The streets are awake. Wheels creak, chickens scatter, and the day begins in earnest. You return to your quarters, footsteps quiet, heart quieter still. Inside, you go straight to the desk. You unlock the drawer. You take out the folded pages, the hidden corrections, the fragile, elegant loops that tell a different story than the one you just recited. You lay them out. You smooth them flat. The stars are gone from the sky, but they are here, on the paper, waiting. And you wonder, as you pick up your quill again, how long it will be before someone else dares to say what the numbers already know. You don't have the answer, but you write anyway. And as the sun climbs higher, washing the frost from the tiles, you feel a strange stillness settle in your chest. A kind of closing, but not an ending. Because now, our long journey nears its final breath. And that's where we'll leave it for tonight. From frost-bitten towers, where students copied the stars by candlelight, to the quiet chambers where Copernicus revised the sky in secret. From ink-smudged margins and lost diagrams, to the polished ceilings of noble observatories, where silence meant survival. A long, slow walk through the forgotten corridors of a revolution, written not in thunder, but in pencil lines and parchment. If you're still awake, thanks for sticking with me all the way to the end. And if you drifted off somewhere, between the whisper of epicycles and the scribbles of the heliocentric underground, that's perfectly fine too. That's kind of the whole point. If you enjoyed this slower, sleep-friendly dive into history, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it was when you pressed play. It's always lovely to see how far these late-night stargazing walks are traveling. For now, I'll let the quills rest, the candle smoke curl away, and the stars, faded by dawn, wait quietly until night returns. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.